Once again, good morning. On behalf of Willamette University, welcome to the very first Willamette University Symposium on Immigrant and Refugee Services in the city of Salem. I'm Joyce Millen, Associate Professor of Medical Anthropology and African Studies here at Willamette. I've had the great pleasure of working in multiple countries in my life, and for the past 10 years, I've conducted research with transnational migrants in, out of, and between West Africa, the United States and Canada, and Europe. Through these experiences, I've developed a deep personal appreciation for the challenges that face new immigrants and refugees. And for this reason, I am delighted to be here today to help host this symposium. At the end of 2015, the World Economic Forum made 10 predictions about international migration. The forum predicted that Europe's asylum crisis would get worse, and as you know, it has. They predicted that the number of refugees worldwide would rise to yet new historic levels. They have. They also predicted correctly that migrants will send home more money than ever before, that there will be, in the future, more women migrants than men, that the global war for talent will intensify, that migration issues will be a game changer in the United States and French elections, as well as the UK decision whether or not to exit the European Union. Once again, the forum was prescient. They also predicted, and importantly for us, that integration failures will loom large, and that migration policy will continue to flounder and will be largely short-term, reactive, and ineffective. Lastly, they wrote, in slightly more sanguine terms, that we will all have reason to thank a migrant. A migrant health worker, the forum wrote, will care for you or your relatives. A migrant teacher will help educate and care for your children. You will depend on technology developed by a migrant entrepreneur. Migrants will do jobs that you are perhaps unwilling to do, allowing you to live more comfortably. You will continue to enjoy migrant food, culture, and music. In immigration scholarship, there is an ongoing discussion about whether transnational migration should be characterized, as it often is, as a new phenomenon. From what we learn in conventional news media, it feels very new. Yet we know that people have long migrated great distances, long before the advent of national borders, for example. And such migrations are indeed how humans have come to spread out throughout the world. But even though we can say with some authority that migration, including mass migration, is not new, there are aspects of contemporary migration that are quite different and demand our attention. We are seeing international migration grow, not only in scope, but also in complexity and in impact. For example, the number of international migrants, those persons living in a country other than where they were born, reached 244 million last year, a figure which includes 65 million refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people around the world. This 244 million people of last year indicates a whopping 41% increase in international migrants from the year 2000. Also, unlike at any time before, today, almost every country in the world is simultaneously a country of origin, destination, and transit for international migrants. At the 15th United Nations meeting on international migration held this past February, government representatives in attendance from around the world acknowledged that international migration is now a priority for the international community. The prioritization is manifesting in many ways. For example, international migration is now infused into multiple levels of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, with emphasis on 7 specific aims. I'll read these to you, and then we will welcome our mayor, who's here to also welcome you. These aims are: respect the human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migration status. Second, to take into account vulnerabilities faced by migrants, refugees, and internally displaced peoples. They also call on us to recognize the contributions of migration for global sustainable development, to address forced displacement and humanitarian crises, promote international cooperation, support the right of citizens to return to their countries of origin. And the 7th aim the United Nations encourages is perhaps the one that is most relevant to us at this symposium here today, and that is to strengthen the resilience of host communities. We'll now hear from our mayor, Chuck Bennett, and then we will give a bit of a structure and discussion of the context of the symposium.
Well, thank you, Dr. Millen, and all of you who are here today to make this symposium possible. For those of you I haven't met, and it is a lot of you, my name is Chuck Bennett. I'm the mayor here in Salem. This is a real pleasure for me. I am a graduate of Willamette University, and it's in fact Willamette that brought me to Salem 50 years ago. And as a graduate and as an arrival here in Salem, I'm thinking back 50 years. It suddenly struck me thinking back 50 years. This was the archery field, actually, at Willamette when I arrived. I arrived over at the train station with my suitcase from Spokane, Washington. And solely for the purpose to attend the university, which I know must pale in comparison to the newness of arriving here as a recently resettled refugee or immigrant. I felt like one. I was 17. I'm in a new town. I didn't know anybody, but I still keep thinking of what that must be like. And I've met refugees who've arrived here virtually the night before I met them, and I just cannot imagine what that must be like. I'm lucky. I've been able to call Salem my home now for decades, half a century. And the memory of those new moments in town, though, hang with you. They're not something you forget. And I'm sure all of you have been through this usually it occurs at that moment you leave home. Imagine leaving home. I mean, literally, your country, your home, the whole thing. It, to me, continues to be one of the really moving events of our time, has been this resulting, particularly in the refugee situation, but along with it, the decision to immigrate. I know that for all our new arrivals, whether they be some of you here as university students that I can see, or our immigrant and refugee populations, we want to make sure you receive a warm welcome here in Salem. We have prided ourselves on being a welcoming city. By vision, by ordinance, by resolution, we've declared ourselves an inclusive city, and we're one that we're proud to be home for a number now of folks that are moving here, whether from nearby countries or from countries a long way away under conditions that are certainly less than ideal, not hopping off a train with your suitcase to go move into your nice dorm. Our city ordinance in Salem speaks to an expectation that all persons shall fully experience the life of this city. We work daily through a multitude of efforts, whether it's through volunteerism of local community members, the work of our local nonprofit organizations, through the efforts around eradicating discrimination, through development work that lifts up our local community and community to help create jobs, affordable housing, and a social network that immigrants and refugee communities can both join, contribute to, and use in this community. Salem is a city that is absolutely diligent about our responsibility to every new resident that moves here, no matter their place of origin. I really appreciate the opportunity that has been afforded here to gain from the research that's being done, from the collected wisdom of the folks in this room, to help us as a city improve our efforts. All of us try to imagine. I've described, trying to imagine coming off the train, what it would have been like. You can't. I don't believe it can be done. We applaud Willamette for the work it's doing in this area. We need help. All communities need help in finding practical, meaningful ways to share our community with our new arrivals. We need that help, and your work will assist us. I hope each of you enjoy and learn from what you hear today from the student presenters and sharing among yourselves. I thank you for having me here this morning, and thank you for coming to Salem to do your work. This ensures that Salem will continue to be what we believe it has been in the past and will continue in the future, a welcoming, inclusive city that expects only opportunity and a future for those folks who come here to spend their lives or to spend a few months as they move through into the larger community of Oregon or the United States. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Mayor Bennett, for being here. So before we begin formal presentations, I'd like to take just a few moments to tell you the setup and the context for the symposium. The preliminary idea for the symposium was conceived last year in the course of conversations I had with an extraordinary student, Phoebe Wagner, after she had completed a class I taught called People on the Move. Phoebe was becoming increasingly engaged in working with refugee teens and immigrant families in Portland, and together we had become quite interested to know precisely what was going on here in the city of Salem regarding efforts to assist new immigrant and refugee arrivals. So we worked together to design a research learning component to the same class, People on the Move. Today marks the very last day of this class for the spring. So the students who will be presenting to you today, this is their last day of class. The research learning component required students in the class to leave the comfort of the bubble of campus life to conduct research out in the community. Research that was squarely focused on this question: how are people and organizations in Salem, both public and private, mobilizing efforts to welcome and help integrate new refugee and immigrants in the Salem community? What you will see today is the culmination of the students' work. Many, if not most of you here today, have helped these students in one way or another. We are most grateful to you, and we're very pleased that you've come here to join us today. As you see on the program, we will have 7 students present the fruits of their 7 weeks of research in the community. Please note that the order in which they present is not based on any logical flow of information. Rather, it's based on their class schedules and their availability. So as you will see, we will begin with the housing sector, followed by education and health, and then after lunch, we'll hear from the public and private sectors and employment, and then at the end of the day, it will conclude the symposium with a presentation on the law and legal enforcement. Each presentation will be somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes, followed by 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. Importantly, we are not calling this time Q&A, because the students' presentations are intended to be entry points for discussion, not set ideas or answers. We acknowledge the vast limitations of our research and recognize that most of you have experience in this work and know far more than we do. So we invite you to participate in multiple ways at the conclusion of each presentation by correcting anything that we've perhaps not quite understood, adding new information of relevance, or reflecting on the material in ways we had not considered. Ultimately, our goal for this symposium is to promote productive discussions so that we and other members of the community will continue to learn from one another. Most of you have been involved in something rather amazing here in Salem. Our hope is that the results of our research and the symposium will help document the inception and unfolding of this community-wide work. You will notice that certain student research teams focus more of their energy on refugees, while others speak of both migrants and refugees. As we have learned in our reading in multiple literatures including, for example, academic literature, legal literature, gray literature, ethnographic, nonfiction, narrative, etc., we've learned that these designations are fluid and sometimes even arbitrary. Therefore, regardless of their official designation, People who arrive in Salem from other parts of the world face similar challenges and are likely in need of similar services. Something else you will note is that the students are not presenting the actual lived experiences of Salem's refugees and immigrants. This is because our focus was on the service providers and on volunteers, not the recipients of their efforts. We would have liked to have had lots of involvement and communication with Salem's newest refugees and immigrants, but such research, especially in light of the political climate of the moment, would pose a number of ethical considerations. If you are attentive, you may notice that there will be only one male student in the group. This is the first time in all of my years of teaching that this has occurred in one of my classes. I have absolutely no explanation for this, and I'll leave this up to you to ponder. Also of note is that the students come from all over the United States and represent 5 different countries. You will hear accents from Finland, Australia, Mexico, for example. Lastly, I can say with great pride that these students have worked very hard and have learned tremendously in the course of conducting this research. Collectively, they have learned about opportunities that are accorded newcomers to Oregon and to Salem specifically. But they have also learned of many inconsistencies, inequities, inadequacies in policies, laws, and procedures. Although they have expressed, in the comfort of our classroom, what I would consider to be a rather reasonable level of indignation regarding some of these problems, I have encouraged them to temper their expression of this indignation in their presentations. We'll see if that happens. You will note that several themes run consistently through these presentations. For example, all of the groups explain that the central importance of political climate and also the challenges of trying to build something while in it. As one volunteer coordinator explained, we are building the airplane while flying it. Another important, though sensitive theme that students address is the racialized history of the state of Oregon and the fact that within the state, even today, there remain individuals who simply do not want to live near, employ, house, or socialize with people who appear or behave differently than themselves. So despite considerable spirit of volunteerism and genuine good we have found in Salem, it is clear that deeper personal and community-wide challenges require ongoing, committed attention. Lastly, given the limited space we have available to host this symposium, we were not able to include all of the people in the community involved in immigrant and refugee services, obviously. We regret this. So to address this limitation, CCTV is here with us today filming the symposium. The aim is to make the symposium proceedings available on CCTV and to have DVDs available for a small fee at CCTV. For those of you here who are interested in the information we present, please note that each of the slide presentations and all of the notes will be made available online beginning on Monday, May 15th, through a special Willamette University link. We will send the link out to everybody who has supplied us with your email address, so you don't need to take notes. To introduce more of the intellectual and local context of this symposium, I'm very happy to introduce my co-coordinator and host, Phoebe Wagner.
Thank you very much, Professor Millen, and thank you all for joining us. Good morning. So as Professor Millen said, my name is Phoebe Wagner, and what I'm presenting today is a portion of my honors anthropology thesis that I've been working on throughout this year, titled Humanitarianism in a Neoliberal Age, Refugee Services in Salem, Oregon. What I am sharing today is an extension of this research, and the focus has been on the role of volunteers with privatized community efforts for refugees in Salem. Through the awareness of the prevalence of volunteers in emerging refugee services, this research seeks to explore the motivations of volunteers and to consider the implications of privatized community efforts for comprehensive newcomer services moving forward. To clarify the terminology used in my presentation, my use of humanitarianism comes from the Oxford Dictionary of Social Sciences, which states that humanitarianism is the promotion of basic human welfare in situations of natural disaster or armed conflict, and that humanitarian aid has not been without controversy. My use of neoliberalism refers to the privatization of refugee services, in which, as the Oxford Dictionary of Human Geography explains, individual freedom is given priority. The Oxford Dictionary of Geography provides a thorough definition of neoliberalism as the liberalizing of global markets associated with the reduction of state power, continuing that state intervention in the economy are minimized, privatization, finance, and market processes are emphasized. To understand the complexities of these services and the role of volunteers, my guiding theoretical framework has been Didier Fasson's humanitarian reason. Fasson has made me attune to the language of suffering in connecting to humanitarianism and the ways in which it can serve as motivation for volunteers. As Fasson states, humanitarian reason, by instituting the equivalence of lives and the equivalence of suffering, allows us to continue believing, contrary to the daily evidence of the realities we encounter, in this concept of humanity, which presupposes that all human beings are of equal value because they belong to one moral community. Fasson's focus on humanitarian government explains the connection between church and state for providing refugee services and the connection between faith and humanitarian reason by bringing, quote, Christian thought in the political space. The role of the state is important in the national and individual civilian identity, as humanitarian government does more than just preserve our conception of human. Through the moral sense, it endows us with our own share of humanity. We become more fully human via the manner in which we treat our fellows. This reinforces a power dynamic between refugees and volunteers and shapes the identity of the volunteer in society. Lisa Malky looks critically at the power dynamic and the oftentimes apolitical nature of volunteer efforts. Malky warns that such humanitarian approaches to, for example, refugees as ahistoric subjects, merely human, merely victims, depoliticizes and hinders our understanding of their actual circumstances, yielding the perverse result of a humanitarianism that dehumanizes and at times actively harms its objects. Michael Barnett warns of the term humanitarians being frequently associated with giving unto others without expecting anything in return, and calls into question whether such volunteers truly exist. Provocatively characterized by one veteran as selfish altruists, Barnett continues, aid workers give to others but expect power, esteem, and social status in return. Jennifer Erickson illuminates the problematic nature of taking the responsibility of refugee services away from the state and into private, often church-affiliated community groups. With a heavy reliance on the work of volunteers, Erickson demonstrates the challenges of having little to no accountability or training on behalf of volunteers and the potentially harmful impact that this can have on refugees. Focusing on senior citizens as the primary volunteers with refugee services, Erickson applies Fasson's theory to demonstrate the shaping of identity in society when one's labor is no longer valued. Through this theoretical framework, my research explores what are the motivations and justifications of volunteers with refugee services in Salem, Oregon. How are the services organized and what are the implications? Within growing community efforts, how are significant issues addressed by volunteers? And finally, how does anthropologist Fasson's notion of humanitarian reason help us to understand the role of the volunteer with refugee services? According to the Pew Research Center, in 2016, Oregon resettled 1,293 refugees. With rising housing costs in Portland, the largest city in Oregon, an increasing number of refugees are being resettled here in Salem, which, as we know, is the capital city 1 hour south. This map demonstrates the home countries of refugees in Oregon, and pointing out this map just demonstrates that oftentimes the countries that we associate with refugees, as shown in the media, is sometimes not the exact reality of what the largest populations are here in Oregon. With the percentage of foreign-born persons in Salem at 11.7%, the city is home to many of Oregon's 391,206 immigrants. In many ways, volunteers with refugees in Salem have shared a humanitarian perspective for their motivations and justifications for their role. key aspects of humanitarian organization, as shown by Fasson, Malky, Erickson, have been evident in Salem, including individualistic efforts that are isolated within the city, volunteer-based services that focus on the identity of the volunteer, and a short-term excitement with little planning for the future. At first, it was easy to fit my research findings into the context of humanitarianism. As I continue to understand the work of participants, however, I have found that it is more complicated than simply supporting or contrasting Fasson, Barnett, and Malky. Volunteers play an important role in welcoming Salem's newcomers and have achieved a great deal in just under a year. With an aim for holistic services, the hope for widespread volunteer training, an awareness of the fragility of relying on volunteers, it has become evident that the motivations and justifications of the volunteers are manifold. By recentering the services on refugees rather than volunteers, acknowledging future limitations and challenges, collaborating with professionals and established organizations for support, and allowing for an intersectionality of services, there could be a successful and coordinated effort in Salem that defies the norm of volunteer-led organizations. As Professor Millen stated, the purpose of this symposium is to share information and resources for ongoing efforts to welcome newcomers to the city of Salem. In many ways, the symposium is what we hope will be the first step in creating comprehensive, holistic, and collaborative services that bring together state and community efforts throughout Oregon. Finally, I'd like to offer my sincerest thanks to the community members and service providers who have made this research possible. In particular, I would like to thank Anya and Doug, Bridget, Jenny, Father Zach, Jeff, Jamette, Mr. Lee, and Joelle. A tremendous thank you as well to my advisors, Professor Dobkins and Professor Millen, for your ongoing support and guidance. Thank you as well to Professor Kuhlman for your encouragement and advice. Thank you.
Shockingly, we're a little ahead of schedule here. But we're going to start, is that okay, Olivia? Good? With the housing sector. So we'll have plenty of time afterwards to start our discussions.
Hi, I'm Beth Lyon.
And I'm Olivia Orozco.
And we're the housing team. So before we begin, I do want to warn you all that this is a Prezi, and so it will move. And we avoided including any excessive twists and turns, but if anybody has issues with motion sickness, I just wanted to warn you all that it's going to be a little bit of a ride. So to begin, we wanted to present you all with one of these quotes from one of our interviewees. And this was the head of the housing team at Salem for Refugees, sorry. And she said, "I think the biggest thing initially is stability. It's a really disconcerting thing to think you might lose your house. And this is really common to hear refugees say, this house is too expensive. What's going to happen to me? Am I going to end up on the street?"
And now before we get too far into our findings, we wanted to pause and acknowledge the kind of interconnectedness of all of these sectors. And as Joyce and Phoebe mentioned, we've been divided into teams, but really people, as we all know, don't exist in these separate bubbles, and so they often interact, right? Housing is dependent on stable employment for income and employment on an address to put down on a job application. More than that, kids' education and health and safety, well-being are tied to a place to call home. Bus routes near a place of residence are essential in accessing public services, from transport to school, work, the doctor's office. A 7-day public transport system is essential. Understanding one's legal rights as tenants and documentation requirements for certain services is also really important in navigating this confluence of systems. And so, as you can see, we ended up with this kind of messy web. And so, to find some clarity and guide us, we had a few questions we followed. The first question was really just what's being done. And then from there, we'd like to look at how is this work being done? What are the needs of refugees in the area? How are these services meeting or maybe not meeting these needs? And then looking forward, what are future goals or questions we may have looking forward?
So to answer these questions, we had to start with some research, which means we had to lay out how we would approach this topic with some methods. So to begin, we provided some context, and we got that by doing some academic research, looking into novels and films, and what was really important is that we did some comparative research with other cities. So we looked into what was being done in places in Canada, somewhere in Ohio, Hamilton County, and it was really important to get this information and do a more comparative approach and kind of adopt some of the things that worked to bring them to Salem. And then after that, we did some more local things, and we did participant observation. We actually got to go to the houses of one of our interviewees and attend a refugee knitting group, which you can see a picture of at the top there. And so that was a really great introduction to some of the interactions that we had with the community. And we actually interviewed 3 key community members. The first was the head of Salem for Refugees housing team. The next was a board member at the Salem Islamic Center. And the last was a consultant from the Salem Housing Authority, who's actually currently working at the Marion County Housing Authority while they transition between directors. And so in our research and discussions with people who work with refugees and immigrants, we found the process to be far from a linear progression. This is something we really want to reinforce as we look at this representation of the process a refugee might follow to obtain housing. So the first box that you see here is representative of the public-private partnership that Salem has specifically with the federal government between VOLAGs, who are volunteer agencies. So they are supplied with federal funding to aid refugees at the start of their transition to living in the United States. And that first tick mark there is 8 months, and if that seems short, it's because it is. It used to be 36 months, and it's slowly been cut down over the years. But it's regardless still the maximum amount of time that a refugee can receive government and VOLAG support, and many end up with less. So after their time expires with VOLAGs, their support in securing housing is gone, and they become normal low-income renters looking for a house. And this is where immigrants start their process, as they're not eligible for the same kind of government aid upon arrival. At this point, both refugees and immigrants face a number of barriers, which we've visually represented with this black line that's just appeared there.
And so I'm wondering how many of you are aware of the housing market in Salem, or maybe you saw this article in the Statesman Journal a couple weeks back. But as you can see, finding housing is becoming more and more difficult for everyone, let alone for someone on a low-income budget. And so here you can see it denoted that half of renters are cost burdened, meaning that they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And now, not only are refugees and immigrants often low income and looking for a house in a tough market, but they also face a myriad of more difficult barriers.
So some of these barriers include prejudice and racism, which are still unfortunately prevalent part of our society, and they can affect refugees both individually and systemically as they attempt to secure housing. The next is housing type and size. If a family is larger, as many are, it can be hard to find a house that meets the legal requirements for occupancy. And third is level and source of income. And it can be hard to find a decently paying work when you're new to the United States and may be lacking in language proficiency. Even skilled professionals are hindered if they don't speak the language of their destination country. The employment team will definitely cover more of this later on. And some other things are lack of knowledge of system, the culture, language, and religion, and lack of social networks. And these barriers manifest themselves in these ways as refugees and immigrants are sent into the rental market devoid of designated state and federal support.
And now this period we denoted here with the red rectangle is a time of extreme housing insecurity. And so as Greth mentioned earlier, for immigrants who don't receive these services, their time since arrival has been this time of extreme housing insecurity. And so we also want to pause for a second and acknowledge that though we speak of refugees and immigrants sometimes separately and sometimes together, that the politics of legality really comes into light as you look at the way in which immigration status affects the services, both private and public, that refugee families and immigrants are eligible for. So with refugees are often seen as deserving and undocumented immigrants as not. Regardless of this, public and private services often become important at this time in securing housing, both helping refugees and in some cases immigrants secure housing.
Oops. Oh, yeah. So there's resources that are available specifically to refugees immediately after their time with VOLAG agencies. So there's 2 specific ways that private individuals and organizations become important. The first of which is temporary housing. So if a family doesn't have a place to live, private organizations can provide temporary and transitional housing. The second is rent assistance. So if a family does have a place, there's about a month gap where they're ineligible for TANF, which is a public cash subsidy provided to families who are often unable to make their rent payments. This rent is supplemented by private individuals through donations. Then, on a longer temporal scale, private interests help secure housing in several other ways. A few organizations stood out to us when we were looking into longer-term private aid for refugees. So Salem for Refugees, specifically under their housing team, they have subcommittees, and the first is the Welcome Home team. And they get donations and set up apartments and welcome new families as best they can and try to make their homes and transitions comfortable. The repair team next does repairs both while the family is living there and after they leave, and they can provide really important information about how to fix things themselves, like how to fix a clogged toilet, which can become a disaster if you don't know how to do that. Another thing they do is landlord outreach, which is they build relationships with landlords who are willing to rent to refugees and build their network. Another is temporary housing network, which is really helpful to families who find themselves without housing very suddenly. And lastly, there's curriculum development, where volunteers have been working on simple manuals to teach refugee families about living in a house or apartment. Another organization we looked into was the Salem Islamic Center, and they're very important for a couple of reasons. We actually got an interview with a current board member, and we learned some very important things about what they do. And that is they serve as language and cultural intermediaries, specifically when it comes to housing, but they also provide a community and some support to people who are living in a new place, and they can give them a piece of home. And then the last resource we looked at in the longer term private resources was private individuals. And so groups of individuals have been pooling money to buy houses and rent to refugees at below market rates. And they're also buying and donating essential tools and items to families.
And so now, as well as some private resources, we also identified some public resources that were important. And now the first of which comes from the Department of Human Services, or as you may often know it, DHS. As Greth mentioned earlier, TANF, which is an acronym that stands for Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, is often vital in securing a constant income with which to pay rent. Also, housing authorities, which are local housing authorities, receive money through the federal government, Housing and Urban Development, HUD. There's a couple different layers. So the Marion County Housing Authority has jurisdiction over things that extend past the Salem-Keizer urban growth boundary, and the Salem Housing Authority specifically serves populations within that boundary. And so for our purposes, we focus there. The Salem Housing Authority runs a couple different programs, many targeting folks who are elderly or those who are differently abled, but the programs we found specifically that would cover immigrants and refugees best were under the federal Section 8 housing. And now, Section 8 housing is a federal program that local agencies administer, and specifically the Housing Choice Voucher program under Section 8, which is a room-based voucher that allows families to take this public subsidy and take it out to apply to a private location that they locate on their own, and that meets, of course, federal regulations. And now this program is the Housing Authority's biggest and most popular program as well, and so that leads us to some of the constraints that we found. The first of which I feel like we kind of can predict, and that's funding. And so this affects two ways, capacity and targeted outreach. And so for capacity, the Salem area currently administers about 4,000 of these housing choice vouchers, but there's an 8,000 person wait list, which means about 2 to 3 years of a wait before even finding a home through this. The second is targeted outreach, and you can see the Housing Authority's kind of mission statement on the right here, and they're responsible really to all of Salem as it states, but they have to choose populations that are their priority, and of course in that others are missed. The second we kind of outlined was process, and specifically paperwork and policies, the need for language and cultural competency. We found when we tried to navigate these systems that the complex processes of applying and wait lists, eligibility criteria, paperwork, and hoops needed to jump through was difficult and immense, and that was for 2 privileged English-fluent American-born college students. The third one is politics, and I identified it as politics specifically because the federal government, HUD, defines an eligible immigrant status that dictates who can receive these public services. And now, this stipulation once more kind of reinforces that dichotomy of who is considered deserving and who is considered undeserving. Even when refugees and immigrants are eligible for these public services, they are still often dependent upon volunteers and NGOs to serve as intermediaries to these. The instability of these resources, as well as their limited capacity, coupled with the fact that families go through life in different stages, leads to a reality that's far different from the linear progression that we've denoted here with the timeline.
So back to our linear representation that is not technically accurate, I want to emphasize again how idealized this representation of the process is. But after refugees have been supported by public and private resources, their ideal next steps are unassisted rental and then homeownership.
And now to give some scenarios that kind of deconstruct this linear process. Say your family is being supported by that Section 8 housing choice voucher. You waited the 3 years on the wait list, you located a private property and a landlord who would rent you at a price you could afford for your family. Maybe a family member joins the household who doesn't carry that HUD-eligible immigrant status. This sends you back to housing insecurity. Perhaps you are being housed by a private organization, maybe in a transitional home. You have a child that puts you over the capacity for that property. This sends you back to housing insecurity. Or perhaps you're even being housed without assistance and you're renting on your own. You never received any of the services we outlined earlier. Because Oregon doesn't currently have just cause evictions, your landlord decides they don't want to rent you anymore. They evict you and you're back to housing insecurity. In fact, there's currently a bill, it's House Bill 2004 that's in the Senate, which would require just cause evictions in Oregon. So here's my plug to reach out to your representatives.
So looking forward, our discussions and research have illuminated a couple of opportunities that would help assist refugees and immigrants in overcoming their barriers to housing. The first is increased low-income housing opportunities. An increase in this public resource of housing and general services would benefit refugees and immigrants with eligible immigrant status, as well as many of our other most vulnerable populations. This is perhaps a more difficult and longer-term goal, due both to the variable funding allocation and a lack of capacity, but, especially when looking at the current rhetoric and recent attempted executive actions that disparage refugees and immigrants, this is really important. Another is landlord outreach and education. Private owners may be reluctant to rent to immigrants and refugees because they lack familiarity with them. They may also be concerned about the potential for existing tenants to be intolerant of newcomers. On a shorter and perhaps more tangible level, current private sector efforts, especially by the Salem for Refugees Landlord Committee, should be expanded to establish more connections for both immigrants and refugees and to help educate landlords to overcome these barriers. This could even eventually result in a comprehensive refugee and immigrant-friendly landlord database.
And now cross-cutting these sections lies a need for increased coordination and communication. So in the public-to-public sector, we need to coordinate between jurisdictions so there's less passing of the buck because families are falling in those cracks. In the private sector, we've heard from our interviews and research that there's often duplicative efforts. And so in organizing into a comprehensive place, such as Salem for Refugees, the community can assure that their time and resources are best being utilized. We really are stronger when we work together. And now between public and private, we really find that the logical next step would be some sort of volunteer manual. This would help with the reinventing of the wheel that volunteers go through when they're trying to help families access services like TANF, but it would also help all the volunteers be on the same level and be well informed. We hope this manual is a comprehensive and collaborative effort that's not just focused on housing and that is informed by other locations' efforts as well.
So to end our presentation, after we thank a few people, we wanted to leave you with a few questions. The first is, as the housing market in Salem gets increasingly more complex, how can we ensure that our most vulnerable members of our community, both new and old, have the essential dignity of a roof over their heads? And the second is, how can some of the specific barriers that immigrants and refugees face be relieved and addressed in a way that doesn't generalize or stigmatize their struggles?
And to kind of close, we also wanted to acknowledge some of the folks who helped us. So we wanted to acknowledge Phoebe Wagner, Joyce Millen, Jenny Barishoff, Sandy Garabedian, and Michelle Almuntafki. And so we'll go back and we'll leave you all with these questions and open it up for discussion. We know that we probably don't all have answers, but it's a good place to start. So thank you so much for listening to us.
Before we start, I would like to introduce myself. I am Kelly Toledo, and I am interested in refugee education because I am also a migrant. I learned English by going to my school, so I'm interested in how this certain part of the education system has changed many years later.
And my name is Paige Morrissey, and I am interested in education for refugees because I am an aspiring educator, and I want to better understand how effectively to teach in classrooms where students speak multiple languages, come from diverse cultural backgrounds, and life experiences.
My name is Salome Paul, and similarly to Kelly, I'm interested in this project because I was part of the public education system as an English learner. And from doing this project, I would just like to learn more about how public education, specifically for refugees, functions in the Salem-Keizer School District, as well as Salem at large.
So, in order to make sense of some of the interconnected struggles and triumphs that people on the move experience, we used research gathered from literature and films from the first half of our People on the Move class, which then shaped our driving questions for our research, which in turn directed the second service learning piece of our class of our research gathered from participant observation, close contextual analysis of peer-reviewed work, and interviews with community members. The interviews with and the information gathered from these members whom we interviewed has shaped the content of our presentation as well as the way in which this content will be presented.
So our presentation is outlined from a macro to micro level. We will first talk about education legislation at the national level, then about newcomer education at the state level, and finally the centralization of the Salem-Keizer School District and Chemeketa Community College at the local level. Common themes we will focus on within each of these levels are language, specificity, and interconnectedness. We have found that the realities and needs of students are illuminated through these themes. To understand these themes in the context of our research, it is important to refrain from conflating a student's English language proficiency with their intellectual or cognitive ability, for students to have teachers and curriculum that are reflective, and for the basic human needs to be met in order for them to succeed in school.
With consideration to the common themes of language, specificity, and interconnectedness, please watch this video where Senator Patty Murray of the state of Washington questions the current U.S. Department of Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos.
What if you could carry so hidden? It was like the footsteps of the
Yes, I do. Good. So can you commit to us tonight that you will not work to privatize public schools or cut a single penny from public education?
Senator, thanks for that question. I look forward, if confirmed, to working with you to talk about how we address the needs of all parents and all students. And we acknowledge today that not all schools are working for the students that are assigned to them. And I'm hopeful that we can work together to find common ground in ways that we can solve those issues and empower parents to make choices on behalf of their children that are right for them.
I take that as not being willing to commit to not privatizing public schools or cutting money from education.
Well, I guess I wouldn't characterize it in that way.
Well,
In the video, Senator Murray is questioning the funding of education at the national level. What we have learned is that the defunding of education at the national level leaves all students, especially those who are under the English learning umbrella, at risk of receiving the funding they need. What is meant by English learner, especially at the state level, are all the programs that fall under this umbrella, such as House Bill 3499, Senate Bill 1564, and Title III. This illustration found at the Oregon Department of Education demonstrates the limited funding for EL programs at the state level. As you may have noticed, ODE does not have a refugee unit, but the need for it has been voiced.
Prior to DeVos' confirmation as the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, the Trump administration introduced House of Representatives Bill 610 in January 2017. H.R. 610, officially known as the Choices in Education Act of 2017, is a House of Representatives bill that will work to distribute federal funds for elementary and secondary education in the form of vouchers for eligible students. The bill has not yet been voted on, but some of the implications to highlight are that it will first abolish the Nutritional Act of 2012, which provides nutritional standards in school breakfast and lunch. For our most vulnerable, this may be the only nutritious food that they have in a day. Second, H.R. 610 will also eliminate the Elementary and Education Act of 1965 that is currently known as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. ESSA is a national act that provides equal opportunities in education through programs such as ESL, AP, and rural education. In addition, ESSA also provides services for students who are differently abled by ensuring access to the general education curriculum and accommodations on assessments. The future of HR 610 is still undetermined, but it is important to keep in mind that the priorities in education are determined by those who are in control. This reality leads us to question how education will operate on the state and local level when the Secretary of Education on the national level has never been a part of the public education system, nonetheless refugee education.
So, to engage with one of our themes of language, it's important to note that the top 4 languages in Oregon besides English are Spanish, Russian, Vietnamese, and Arabic. Our interviewees informed us that there are many linguistic resources available for Spanish speakers, but we need more options for those who speak languages other than English and Spanish. In addition, there is often a misconception that one's inability to speak English translates into their incompetence as a student. This myth, alongside a continuous struggle of educational institutions to simultaneously teach language and content, often means that students are learning simplified material that may not match their specific cognitive abilities. For example, there's a refugee student currently here at Willamette who voiced that their experience with English language classes prior to college had a lack of rigor and linguistic support, so they resulted to having to teach themselves content, which is admirable, although it's demonstrative of the institution's lack of awareness of the intellectual capabilities of newcomer students.
One of the tools that the ODE uses to monitor and assure the success of all EL students is the EL Outcome Advisory Group that was developed through House Bill 3499. One of the lessons that has come from the EL Advisory Group is the importance of having educators go to the parents and students rather than always expecting parents to come to the schools. When refugees come to a new country, they are often expected to be the ones who make all the effort in attempting to understand the new space. By advising educators to go to the parents and students rather than having them always come to the schools, more reciprocal relationships can be created, and the barrier between school and home can become more gray.
To examine what kinds of programs are available for refugees in major cities that could potentially be a model for Salem, we look to IRCO in Portland. Founded in 1976 for refugees by refugees, IRCO is an immigrant and community organization that strives to promote the integration of refugees, immigrants, and the community at large into a self-sufficient, healthy, and inclusive multi-ethnic society. Its interconnectedness is found through its employment, housing, and educational services, to name a few. IRCO provides culturally specific services such as one-on-one tutoring, after-school activities, gang prevention and intervention, transition for middle school programs, increasing the number of youth graduating from high school, and encouraging college and career opportunities. And some of the spaces at IRCO that provide these services are the Asian Family Center and Africa House, both of which are culturally and linguistically specific.
At the district level, Salem-Keizer Public Schools also have specialized spaces for new incoming students. In order to be inclusive and not assume the experiences nor immigration status of new incoming students, the SKSD uses the term newcomer to describe all migrants, refugees, and undocumented students with specialized English needs. When a new family enters the SKSD, there are 3 main paths that parents can choose for their middle or high school newcomer student. These are going to newcomer centers, English language programs with a student's designated school, or direct enrollment to a school with no specialized program. Students are expected to be in the newcomer center at least 1 year, but can stay up to 3. English language development, or ELD, classes include a variety of subjects. Once students reach an intermediate level language proficiency, they are sent to their home, middle, or high school. To better serve the needs of students of color, students of poverty, and English language learners, Salem-Keizer School District appointed the first Director of Student Equity, Access, and Advancement. In order to understand the role of the school district in assisting newcomers with their transition to a new country and the educational system, when a new elementary school student enters the district as a newcomer with limited English proficiency, they are guided by an English language acquisition specialist, otherwise known as ELOS. Throughout the beginning weeks of a student's arrival, ELOS assists students by demonstrating classroom rules, helping them figure out safe routes to and from school, and helping them navigate how to choose the appropriate food in the lunch line. Through these services and many more, ELOS provide guidance that is seemingly mundane for students who grew up with and are familiar with the U.S. educational system.
In terms of college readiness, teachers ensure to hold conversations with families of high school newcomer students to discuss their track to graduation. Students have the option of partnering with Chemeketa Community College to take classes for college credit. Although college access programs such as Willamette Academy and AVID can be utilized, a certain level of English proficiency is required in order to use these services. Despite the inaccessibility of college access programs to many newcomers, there are some ELD teachers that use AVID strategies in their classes. Another way newcomer students can meet their graduation requirements on time is to provide work samples as opposed to standardized tests. We believe, and studies have shown, that the success of a student, in this case, a student who is a newcomer, should not be solely measured by standardized testing, especially in a new country where the educational system is unfamiliar. Education is not a one-size-fits-all, especially when the demographics, languages, and experiences of students are constantly changing.
While newcomer high school students have the option to take classes at Chemeketa for college credit, adult learners in the community who are not enrolled at Chemeketa can take English to speakers of other languages, or ESOL, classes in their language lab. The ESOL Language Lab offers English and technology instruction for English learners at beginning through advanced levels. Preparation for the test of English as a foreign language, GED programs, and the high school equivalency program, or HEP, is also provided. Classes are $75 per term, but refugees are able to take classes for free. And Chemeketa students who speak the native language of adult learners, called conversation partners, are also available as a resource for language acquisition. And because all of the students in the language lab are adult learners, many of them face the difficulty of balancing the responsibility of getting an education with work and family. The majority of these students are women and have children, so going to the language lab and learning English at the same time can be very difficult to accomplish without support.
With the demographics of newcomers constantly changing, teachers in SKSD face the challenge of providing linguistic support for students who speak a variety of languages. Although bilingual assistance is provided to many Spanish-speaking students at the elementary and secondary level, students speak many other languages like Arabic, Somali, or Maimai that receive little to no linguistic support from teachers. Currently, there are 60 to 70 newcomers at the elementary level, and each are placed at a level 1 English language proficiency. Out of these, none of them are Spanish speakers. Other services, such as transportation to bilingual classes, are provided to Spanish-speaking students in kindergarten through 3rd grade. When working with students who speak other languages, teachers do have the option to ask for an interpreter, but this may not be an effective and continuous source of support for newcomers because day-to-day support is not guaranteed.
Because of the number of newcomer students are fairly new, the goal is to figure out structures and systems to support these newcomers. Basically, we're trying to build a plane while we fly it, said Elementary Bilingual Resource Program Assistant at the Salem Public Schools. Teachers at all grade levels are in need of information and professional development to assist newcomer students because many of them have no background of their students' language, culture, or life experience. Although most elementary teachers are ESOL endorsed, this does not necessarily mean that they can provide all the linguistic support that these students need. ESOL instructors may have some experience with scaffolding and providing curriculum to newcomer students, but this happens at varying degrees. Some secondary teachers are ESOL endorsed, but not all. A new development that has arisen out of the need to assist refugee students specifically are trauma trainings that teachers and volunteers are required to take. The depth with which these trainings address are varied, but broadly, they cover how to support refugee students who may be arriving from a new country after living through traumatic experiences, such as war. Another new development that has arisen out of the need to assist newcomer students is the position of a community school outreach coordinator. With the outreach coordinator, teachers can now anticipate a new family coming and try to prepare accordingly. This is a contrast to the old model where new families would arrive and schools would have to find ways to adjust to students' needs with no prior preparations.
At the community level, Salem for Refugees has used outreach and education to propel volunteers to action. Currently, there are around 15 Chemeketa students and some Salem for Refugees community members who volunteer with the Salem-Keizer School District. At the elementary level, teachers will communicate with the district to indicate what kind of help newcomer students need, and then volunteers will be paired accordingly. The volunteer training provided by the ELOS includes differing educational assistance based on a student's need, information on where newcomers are from, an overview of what a typical school day would look like, busting assumptions about English language learners, a brief introduction to trauma-based training, and also access to ELOS contacts if they need them. Additionally, what may be the most important part is that Salem for Refugees helps in areas where the school district is not lawfully allowed, such as tutoring in a student's home, for example.
So what? Why does any of the information we have just presented matter? It matters because refugees, similarly to all of humanity, deserve an education and the opportunity to live a better life. Equitable education means access to an education that holistically meets the needs of all of our students and encompasses the intersecting struggles that come not only with migration, but also the race, class, and gender of all those that are involved. Education is not and cannot be equitable if it does not actively advocate for the needs of every student.
To conclude our presentation, we would like to thank all of those who lended us their time, knowledge, and resources. Without these community members, this project would not have been possible.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Maddie.
I'm Shannon.
And I'm Elle. And today we're going to be talking about health-seeking behavior and limitations for migrant and refugee communities in Salem.
Prior to starting our research, we looked at immigrant and refugee health from a medical anthropology perspective. We used the critical theory as a way of analyzing the situation. With the critical theory, health is a biologically and socially holistic experience. Surroundings have a huge impact on the health of an individual. Additionally, we looked at the concept of the body politic. The body politic includes people who are regarded as a collective political entity under the government. In this manner, we question who is included in this. Does the lack of legal documentation and health services from the government disregard immigrants from this population? We want to pose a question for you to think about throughout this presentation. Who is entitled to be healthy?
Our methods involved reading relevant literature on research that has already been done on this subject, Shannon's own fieldwork in a local clinic, and conducting 6 interviews with relevant people in Salem Health Services, from volunteers to interpreters to healthcare providers, trying to establish what care is offered, if it is adequate and attentive to these populations, and who might be falling through the cracks. We found that health in the first few weeks of arrival can be a very confusing time for newcomers and their families. Upon arrival, refugees are required to have a lengthy health check. The unfortunate part of living in Salem is that the closest screenings are only currently being conducted in Portland. So imagine a family of 8 with 6 children ranging from ages 1 to 16. The details involved with this seemingly simple requirement can actually be quite complicated for both refugee families and volunteers. We want to highlight that having a large family is not a burden, just that there are several details that need to be accounted for, such as, how do we get there?
Where do we get a car big enough to fit the family and the volunteer that is helping? Will there be a car seat available for the baby?
Will the right interpreter be present?
How will they assess health without any past health records?
How does this medical system work?
Why am I in a room alone with a stranger? Why can't my family join me?
This family is based on a real story that we heard from a volunteer during an interview, and is a common experience shared by Salem refugees and volunteers. We found this to be a very telling yet overlooked piece to providing help to refugee families upon arrival. The immigrant narrative can be much different. Without the proper resources and guidance upon arrival from volunteer organizations and caseworkers, these populations often go to the hospital for less serious illness or do not seek medical care at all, especially given the possibility of being reported to ICE. Unknowns and legitimate feelings of being overwhelmed are present in both the refugee and immigrant arrival narratives. However, immigrants must grapple with the lack of assistance and the precarity of being undocumented. Shown here is a quote from a Spanish interpreter that we interviewed, and it speaks to the fears of immigrant communities that she has worked with. This fear is a great barrier to seek out medical care, whether that be the fear of being humbled or turned away or not even knowing what to expect. Citizens can volunteer to be sponsors to undocumented families and help cover medical bills, but this still requires connections and feeling comfortable reaching out, as well as parties willing to make this commitment.
Immigrants move around a lot within a state or country to find work. Their transient nature makes it hard for immigrants to become established in a community. Additionally, fear often causes immigrants to live in the shadows. This makes getting in contact with them more challenging. Put yourself in the shoes of an immigrant. You have just arrived in the United States, and you have to put yourself out there to learn the resources in the community. Once you find out what resources are available, you don't know what questions will be asked, who may end up with this information, or what fees may occur. If you don't have the privilege of having a sponsor, who do you reach out to? This requires a lot of vulnerability. However, immigrants don't have the privilege to be vulnerable, as that could lead to fear of deportation. To our knowledge, the Salem Free Clinics is the only clinic in Salem that offers free health services to individuals without insurance. This entirely volunteer-run clinic has cardiologists, orthopedists, dentists, family doctors, physical therapists, counselors, and more. While the Salem Free Clinics has been established for over 10 years, it is still an unknown resource to a lot of people in the area. Despite this, there's still a high demand. If a patient speaks English, they are able to be seen by a doctor in just 3 days. However, if a patient is Spanish speaking, it could take 3 weeks or more due to a lack of interpreters available. I spent some time at the Salem Free Clinics for my fieldwork. I'm going to share with you the daily routine of the clinic. The day starts with a community prayer of the volunteers. The patient arrives and is prompted with background health history paperwork, HIPAA forms, and questions of Social Security and health care programs. The patient is then offered a prayer, and it is explained that this clinic has church affiliations, but patients are not required to be religious for medical attention. The patient is then taken to pray if they opt to, then is seen by a nurse and a doctor. Research has shown that immigrants and refugees often come to a new country with a faith that is central to their life, whether it be Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Hinduism, or another religion. This faith has usually provided strength and sustenance during incredibly difficult times. Some progress has been made on recognizing the importance of faith in healing, but overall, current U.S. medical systems do a poor job of integrating faith systems into treatment. Such faith systems could be crucial to a client's recovery and resiliency. The Western biomedical model can provide restrictions on health for immigrant and refugee populations. The image on the screen is an example of differences between the so-called East and West that may be present amongst two countries. There are several fundamental differences in healthcare that stem from altering worldviews and cultural values. One difference includes the individual versus collective worldview. The U.S. healthcare system focuses on medical problems of the individual patient. However, patients may also come from a more collectivist culture where community needs are placed above individual needs. Other challenging aspects of the biomedical industry include unfamiliar terms, the cost of clinic services, and administrative obstacles. Many refugees understand health and wellness in ways that are distinctly different from Western medical perspectives. Most Western countries adhere to bio, psycho, and social worldviews of health. However, some other countries relate health problems to causes such as supernatural forces like witchcraft, lack of faith, lack of balance in the body, or personal weakness. However, biomedicine did not recognize many of these causes. Moving forward, we have to remember that the Western biomedical system is just one system. It's not the only system. There are different conceptions of the body and different conceptions of healing. This prompts a question: how can we adapt the biomedical system to be a more inclusive healing environment?
There's a lot of crossover and factors that inhibit health-seeking behavior in both immigrant and refugee populations. Some of these inhibitors include, but are not limited to, xenophobia and racism, unfamiliarity with biomedical practices, pre-existing medical conditions, language barriers, job security, pressure to assimilate, and fear of deportation. The only thing that separates the two in one's ability to seek healthcare is legal status. Undocumented immigrants are excluded from comprehensive coverage and do not have access to a social security number, which is extremely limiting in the avenues with which they can pursue care. The following is an example of the extra roadblocks some immigrants face due to legal status. Individuals cannot apply for documentation for 5 years. In this time, they are uninsured due to their so-called illegality. Only then can immigrants apply for coverage by the Oregon Health Plan, knowing that these programs have a high rejection rate. After this extensive wait, those whose applications were accepted must then sign a waiver agreeing to not be a burden to the government. This intentional language creates a further stigma, communicating to immigrants that they are unwelcome, making them even less inclined to seek medical care. Immigrants and refugees oftentimes have a shared narrative of extreme trauma or circumstances that make home unsafe. Mental health poses a distinct challenge. Refugees and immigrants have been in survival mode. Though these experiences vary drastically, they include individuals who have suffered resource scarcity, exposure to violent conditions, living in camps for years, losing loved ones, or leaving them behind in the same volatile conditions from which they fled. When these groups arrive in Salem, they become preoccupied with becoming self-sufficient. According to federal standards, getting a job is first priority. This creates a new high-stress environment as these populations struggle to establish themselves. Individuals struggle at times to even seek care for acute medical issues. As time goes by and these populations become more secure and individuals are able to begin to let their guard down, this is when mental health issues really begin to come to fruition. When these groups arrive in Salem, they become preoccupied with becoming the Western model of a patient-therapist relationship cultivated over time will not work within this context, especially given language barriers. Developing programs that are more peer support-oriented will be more effective, as illustrated by Pathways to Wellness. Pathways is a service offered in Portland that we believe would be beneficial to have in Salem, so these valuable services can be more accessible to those resettled within our community. Pathways partners believe that integrating early detection and support for mental health problems into refugee resettlement, combined with culturally appropriate and effective treatment, reduces resettlement stress and accelerates the healing process. Current services offered by Pathways to Wellness include refugee health screeners, training for social service and health professionals, wellness and adjustment support groups, which include a women's weaving group, garden support groups, and a new arrival adjustment group. We believe this type of group support is adaptable to Salem. As this refugee population grows in our community, there are more members who will be able to support one another. Similar services could also be implemented to support the immigrant community as well. When working with these populations, we urge healthcare providers to utilize health profiles such as ones available through EthnoMed in treating both immigrant and refugee patients. These health profiles can give providers an understanding of the conditions experienced by individuals prior to their resettlement. This can aid in both giving physicians cultural context, allowing them to treat patients sensitively based on their needs, in addition to aiding in understanding previously experienced living conditions, which can have valuable insights in coming to a diagnosis. For a more extensive understanding of barriers faced by these populations, another resource that can be utilized to aid in providing crucial mental health care is the recent guide, Walking Together, conducted by Lutheran Community Services.
We noticed that there is a gap in preventative care and health education as compared to larger cities like Portland. However, there are some great resources in Salem already. We went to the CHEC Center, or Community Health Education Center, across the street at the Salem Hospital, which is a great community resource with information in multiple languages about health and nutrition. Similarly, WIC, or Women, Infants, and Children, is a public health resource specifically for low-income mothers and children to provide nutritional resources. The reinforcement of utilizing programs like this by volunteer organizations and caseworkers would help in the efforts of preventative care and nutritional help for newcomers. Nutritional services are a major need and is a key preventative tool for these populations, especially given new exposure to new diets and eating habits in the United States.
Studies have shown that migrants often have better health than general U.S. natives when they first arrive, despite less access to healthcare, lower income, and other barriers. Additionally, with each successive generation that stays in the United States after migration, health declines. This is likely due to the nutrition paradox. The Western lifestyle promotes a diet that does not support health. The media constantly advertises unhealthy food. Thus, for newcomers, this type of food may seem like a good, cost-effective option. Additionally, fast food chains target their marketing to these individuals by increasing advertisements and placing more of their restaurants in low socioeconomic areas. So how do we help this? Could we implement programs such as farmers market coupons, which elderly individuals currently receive in Salem, in which immigrants and refugees could have a set amount of food they could receive at the local farmers market each week? We see that WIC has already started to introduce farmers market coupons for low-income populations.
Looking on to the future, there is a lot of potential in our community for our new neighbors. West Salem Clinic, pictured here, is gearing up to start administering the required refugee health screenings in Salem, which would cut down on much of the detail-oriented organizing to get to Portland. Similarly, the Portland program Pathways to Wellness, as Elle mentioned, is in the process of opening a branch in Salem. With these additions, we as a community are making strides to provide the best resources for newcomers. What we have learned through our research is that cohesion within all of these areas of health is crucial to providing adequate and approachable care. Having a way to lessen duplications for volunteers and going back to square one with a family will make their experience easier and lessen volunteer burnout. There are so many wonderful volunteers in our community that making their efforts to help our new neighbors flow a little easier is an important next step and will enhance the newcomer experience.
Okay, so this is the definition of refugee provided by the UN that is considered somewhat universal and has been adopted in the United States. It reads, a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution. Our research has led us to ask, who gets to decide what is a well-founded fear? And does this definition reinforce the binary between immigrant and refugee, playing into notions of deserving and undeserving people?
Refugees are survivors. Their journeys are testaments to courage, hope, faith, love, and the resilience of the human spirit. We encourage providers to walk together with the refugee clients in helping them transition to their new lives. In this way, both providers and refugees learn from and are inspired by one another. Just as refugees are survivors, immigrants are survivors too, and we think they should be included in this concept. With this, we want to leave you with one question. How can we make the biomedical system more approachable and comfortable for populations with different conceptions of the body and healing?
And of course, Professor Millen and Phoebe, we'd like to thank you again, but these are the people that helped with our research, and we just want to thank you all again. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Michaela.
And I'm Hania, and we're the state team. And the focus of our research was trying to understand the state's role in resettlement process, specifically constructing an ethnographic history of the Oregon Office of Refugee Resettlement. Where's the mouse? Oh. That's not it. Sorry. Drum roll. There we are. Okay. Can we get full screen? Cool. Okay. So the guiding questions for our project were, what is the office? What is the office's role in the resettlement process? And how, when, and why was the office created? Guided by theory that the past shapes the present, that mobility is not new, and that Oregon's Office for Refugee Resettlement is the result of federal legislation in response to global migration crises, to explore our questions, we took a historical approach to understand the wider context and events that led to the office's creation. We approached our analysis by doing what anthropologist Laura Nader called studying up in the halls of power, to understand the multiple layers of power structures that interacted to create and shape the office as it exists today. Specifically, we drew on Nader's advocacy to study not only up in the halls of power, to understand that the Refugee Resettlement Office is part of the larger U.S. resettlement system that's a result of a series of ad hoc responses to the global migration crises, but to study down and sideways to understand the ways in which the office works with bow legs to administer state services to serve refugees.
So our research methods included 2 key interviews with 2 of the operation and policy analysts from the Oregon Office for Refugee Resettlement, whom we will refer to as the Oregon office throughout this presentation, just to keep you with us. We also interviewed another person at the state. We conducted a literature review exploring the history of resettlement in the United States and public-private partnerships in other countries. We also conducted archival research at the Oregon State Library to examine Oregon's own history with resettlement. Okay, there we go. So here you can see some examples of the Oregon Office annual fiscal reports that we found in our archival research. Oh, sorry. We reviewed reports from their original creation in 1990 to when they ceased production in 2002. These annual reports helped us to understand how Oregon's programs have adapted to more effectively serve refugees over time. The reports included local news events on refugees and immigrants, which provided a snapshot for us of what was going on in Oregon each year. One of the things the annual reports did in the very beginning, which we're really grateful for, was provided case studies. And these case studies were short stories of refugees and their experiences as they entered into the United States, which provided a human face for us. The annual reports were extremely helpful for us to understand the history of the resettlement process in the United States, but in Oregon specifically. So since we were researching the resettlement office, we felt it was really important to understand what resettlement actually is. So what is resettlement? The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, considers resettlement to be one of 3 durable solutions to displacement. The others are voluntary repatriation and integration. So resettlement is an organised and orderly departure. The processing of a refugee claim is made outside of the nation, which will be providing protection. A refugee will arrive with full legal status of a refugee and thereby of a permanent resident. So upon arrival in the United States, refugees are assisted through both public and private, federal and state. So for example, upon arrival, each refugee will receive a cash payment from the federal government, which will assist them in getting established in the United States, which is administered through state services. In Oregon, single refugees receive $339 and 2 people would receive $432, sorry. Because this amount is so low, voluntary agencies, who you will hear referred to as VOLAGs throughout the day, step in to supplement the funding. So refugees are also able to apply for federally funded benefits. If they have children, they're eligible for TANF, which stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. If they are childless, they are eligible for refugee cash assistance for 8 months. We feel it's really important to mention at this point that these are the same benefits that are accessible to citizens of the United States who are living in poverty. TANF benefits bring families at most to half the poverty line.
So at first we really struggled to understand what the state does because it was so intertwined with the federal level, and also everything that the state did seemed to be part of another group's focus. So for example, the state administers housing and education services in partnership with private agencies. But later this made sense when we learned that the goal of the Office for Refugee Resettlement is really to link newcomers to critical resources that help facilitate the integration process. So this raised the question, why are they interconnected, and why is the state's role threaded throughout the entire process? And this again required taking a look at the history that led to the office's creation. So until the 1980s, the U.S. resettlement system was a series of ad hoc responses to migration crises across the globe, which created a number of contradictions in the system. The 1980 Refugee Act was an effort to streamline the U.S. resettlement process. This act has shaped the Oregon office and the resettlement system in the United States as we know it today. This act incorporated the United Nations definition of refugee that was established in 1951. It clarified the objectives of the U.S. refugee program as gearing towards self-sufficiency. It authorized benefits and welfare such as cash assistance that Michaela mentioned. And importantly, it established federal as well as state-level offices for refugee resettlement. So these offices have 3 types of programs through which to administer federal services. So,
Each of these programs share the goal of effectively resettling and providing assistance in attaining economic self-sufficiency for refugees. Each of these programs has an 8-month time limit for the services that they provide. However, they are administered in different ways. So, state-administered programs are federally supported, but it is the state who is administering the programs that offer refugee cash assistance, refugee medical assistance, and social services. Wilson Fish is an alternative program to state-administered programs that came out of the Wilson Fish Amendment to the Refugee Act. It offers services through different incentives that are tied to employment goals. And the public-private partnership, which is what Oregon now has, is a different approach to both of these. In a public-private partnership, the VOLAGs provide the refugee cash assistance, case management, and employment services. And refugee medical assistance is provided through the state. In Oregon, the VOLAGs provide case management, ORCO provide many of the employment services, and the Department of Human Services provide the medical and cash assistance, or medical and cash services. As the VOLAGs act in the case management capacity, it is their role to guide refugees through navigating the Department of Human Services system. Okay, so in order for Hanya and I to understand the role of the office, we had to find out who they were, what they do, and who they work with. And what we learned is that the Oregon office is made up of a 3-person team, but it started out in 1980 as a 6-person team. So today, there is a state coordinator who manages the other team members, but splits their time between this role and then another role within the state. And then there are the 2 operation and policy analysts whom Hanya and I were both lucky enough to interview. They explained to us that the work that they do is more behind the scenes. Since Oregon have a public-private partnership, they do not have direct face-to-face contact with refugees. Their role is more of a coordination and consultation with their partners, who are the VOLAGs and the Department of Human Services. VOLAGs and the Department of Human Services are the people who are working directly with refugees to administer the state services. In the day-to-day work of the operation and policy analysts, they are managing contracts, maintaining a database, and reporting on funding. One of the most important things that we learned throughout our research is that the Oregon office report to the federal government. As Hanya mentioned earlier, the Oregon office is a product of the federal government, and it is the federal government who determine the role that they play in refugee resettlement.
So how did Oregon's public-private partnership come to be, and what could we learn from examining the office's history? So as we mentioned earlier, the Refugee Act of 1980 established both federal and state offices for refugee resettlement. In this year, the Oregon office, the public sector, began working with private sector in Oregon to provide services to refugees. In 1985, the federal government passed the Wilson Fish Amendment, which Michaela mentioned, to provide an alternative model of service. And Oregon actually implemented one of the first demonstration projects in the country, which was focused on employment. And this project gained national recognition. But a year later, the state felt that there were too many constraints tied to the Wilson Fish model and returned to their model as a public-private partnership. However, there remain a number of constraints today of the public-private partnership. One of the major constraints is adherence to federal guidelines in terms of who is eligible for cash and medical assistance. And eligibility has slowly decreased over time. So at the signing of the Refugee Act in 1980, individuals were eligible for 36 months of cash assistance. In 1982, this was decreased to 18 months. In 1989, this was decreased to 12 months. And in 1993, this was decreased to 8 months. And there has been discussion about decreasing this to 6 months. Looking at the history of refugee resettlement in Oregon, we also learned that the distribution of services has changed over time. So in 1980, forums were established in Portland, Salem, and Eugene to better assess local needs and service strategies in each of these areas. In 1984, the Portland Consortium became the official advisory body for the state refugee program. And around that time, refugee arrivals also became increasingly concentrated in Portland. And so as a result, the refugee services and resources were increased there. And so this ultimately led to what we see today, to the state services being concentrated in Portland. And so we wondered whether it might be helpful to reestablish forums here in Salem to assess local needs, given that most of the state services are located elsewhere.
So we learned that the state is limited in what it can achieve by top-down constraints. So our participants explained to us that the Oregon office is a federal program, not a state program. All of the state programs are limited by what the federal government dictates. They are limited in who they can serve by the federal government's decision to use the United Nations definition of refugees. They are also limited in choosing the populations they can serve because the president determines how many refugees can come into the United States each year and also where they're coming from. The federal government is also deciding where refugees will be going. Another key limitation that we found for Oregon, or the Oregon office, is funding. Funding for the programs relies heavily on the political climate, especially who the president is at the time. We learnt that the Oregon office has ambitions to develop new programs to better serve refugees. However, they explained to us that the money is never enough to do all of that. That being said, there are a number of benefits to the public-private public-private partnership, One of the major benefits is complementary services. So what we learned is that in the view of the staff at the Oregon office, the public-private partnership is a good buffer. It absorbs a lot of the shock that refugees receive upon arrival, and it guides people through navigating the Department of Human Services system, finding employment, and setting themselves up for their new lives in Oregon. One of our participants from the Oregon office said this: "I think personally it is good if at least people know where to go to find their answers." And they went on to say, "I think the only thing that might be better is if it was people from their own communities." So throughout our research process, we really struggled with not being able to talk to refugees about their experiences, and were surprised that the individuals who work with them the individuals who work for the state do not necessarily get to work directly with refugees themselves. So we started to wonder if there might be a way to bring the refugees' voices back into the state. One of the major questions surrounding the politics of migration is, how can we bring the state back into social scientific analyses of migration? And our question became, how can we bring the refugee back into the state? We would like to see the Oregon office annual reports brought back in. We believe that another benefit to the public-private partnership is to bring the refugee back into the state. There is potential for the public and private sectors to work together and connect by sharing sample refugee stories to better serve refugees across the state and in Salem. We feel that the qualitative data, such as the stories and the pictures in the original reports, celebrated the refugees as people rather than numbers, and we would really love to see that brought back in.
Given our historic approach, we would like to leave you with a few questions that we don't have the answers to. What does it mean to do this work in a country and state with a uniquely exclusionary and racist history? Given the top-down constraints, how can the state be proactive rather than reactive? And given that funding and the role of the state is so tied to the current cultural norms and values, what roles can citizens play in shifting the current political climate?
So we want to first say thank you to all of you for taking time out of your lives to be here with us today. We really appreciate it. And we want to say a very special thank you to the staff at the Oregon Office for Refugee Resettlement and their other colleague at the state who met with us. We'd like to thank Salem for Refugees, the State Library staff, URCO, Professor Joyce Millen and Phoebe Wagner, and the rest of our amazing class for helping us along this journey. And to end, before we take any questions, I just want to get you all involved in a project that I've been working on. We have been creating a timeline of Oregon's history with refugee resettlement. And you will see on the back there's a lot of black boards, and the information from that has come from URCO's timeline, which was provided to us by Caitlin. If she's here, I'm not sure, but thank you. And also the booklets that we went through in our research. And we have left on your tables, Joyce will hold them up, a little blue card. So if there's anything that you think should be on that timeline, if you've been in Salem and know anything that was going on with refugee services in Salem, we'd really love it if you could write on that and maybe come and find me and I can tack it up. You can't miss me in this skirt. And there are white cards on there as well. And this is Hanya's idea, and we want you to have a think about how you'd like to see refugee services going forward. So if you have any great ideas, maybe write that down and we'll collect it at the end and put it all together and share it with you all. Yeah, so any questions?
I was struck that there's only 3 employees, and how can they handle all the work? What do they? I mean, it seems like it wouldn't be that effective with only 3 people.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a question that a lot of people who work for the state frequently have. So it's not just the refugee agency. I know that one of the individuals mentioned that they've had to drop something. So for example, the fiscal reports were created when she came in, and she's had to stop doing them because they were so much work. And so they have to balance their work and mainly adhere to the federal guidelines.
And she also, sorry?
Mentioned that the reports,
Oh yeah, the reports that we were talking about, we have them here for you all to have a look at if you'd like. They're at the table at the front. Feel free to flip through them. Just following up on your question, in the interview with this particular person, she did explain to us that over time their systems have adapted more as well. So I think that is how, like, as time's gone on, their databases have changed, and maybe jobs that were manual have been automated. And I think I just thought that might be worth mentioning.
So my name is Shelley, and I'm with Department of Human Services, Self-Sufficiency Child Welfare, working out of the District 3 office, which serves Marion, Polk, and Yamhill. And I just want to put the Refugee Resettlement Office, of course, I don't work there, so I don't get to see that daily process. But our district, we work with IRCO. We have IRCO right in our office. Our Kaiser office is probably one of our main office that receives refugees, because we do have IRCO and we have OSPA in our office. And as our participants come in, he greets them and done a fantastic job with getting them employment. I mean, we're so proud and happy to have IRCO in with us. So at the self-sufficiency level offices, we're doing as much as we can do for the refugees. And it's been probably 6 months ago, we actually had a mandatory refugee resettlement training that we did with all staff, and that did include self-sufficiency and child welfare. And we actually just last week won the diversity award from the state for that training. And we had Catholic communities there. It was an absolutely phenomenal training. And I think it really opened the eyes of a lot of staff also, just to hear because we did get to hear the stories from the refugees, which you're right, if you can hear that piece, that's huge.
Yeah. It really does make a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we are a little bit shorter on time than our previous sessions, so is there one last question, or we'll give them a round of applause?
Thank you.
You probably noted the accent. I'm wondering if Michaela will be the only Australian who knows in depth the refugee resettlement in Oregon. Now we will hear from the private sector, from Brenna Anderson and Terry Manpearl. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Terry Manpearl. And I'm Brenna Anderson. In the last 7 weeks, we have been looking at how refugee resettlement is supported by the private sector and various religious organizations here in Salem.
So first, we have to establish what the private sector is. Commonly held definition of the private sector is that it's any part of civil society that is free from government control or ownership. This includes non-governmental organizations, which in the context of refugee resettlement includes VOLAGs. So the voluntary agencies that the state sector mentioned. VOLAGs that have resettlement agencies are contracted by the federal government to provide these services to incoming refugees. Religious organizations, private citizens, and private businesses are also included in the private sector.
In order to learn about the private sector in Salem, we engaged in participant observation by attending meetings at Salem for Refugees and volunteering at Separate Club. We conducted interviews with various people in the community, including volunteers, figures involved in local nonprofits, a local cleric, and a private donor. In order to gain perspective about resettlement and to understand specific systems, we conducted library and archival research. As we will demonstrate, we found that the private sector is integral to the system.
Throughout our research, we noted that currently the majority of both individuals and groups involved in refugee resettlement are religiously affiliated. In addition, it is clear that the abundance of volunteers in Salem is absolutely crucial to resettlement in the area. Salem is a relatively new resettlement site, so we observed that a lot of the support and services that are coming together through grassroots efforts.
In order to understand the specific processes in Salem, it is important to address that there are many different ways to approach refugee resettlement. We can think of resettlement on a spectrum, with countries such as Sweden, Finland, and the Netherlands, where the government is fully and directly provides all support services for refugees on one end. And on the other side of the spectrum is where refugee resettlement is completely funded and supported by the private sector. In the center lies public-private partnerships, which are partnerships between public government institutions and the private non-governmental organization sector. Although refugee resettlement through PPPs can materialize in many different ways, in Oregon and several other U.S. states, the partnerships means that resettlement is contracted by the government to the private sector. The contracted relationships means that resettlement services are federally funded but locally administered. I want to stress that PPPs do not always provide a clear distinction between the public and the private. Although the resettlement agencies are part of private organizations, because the services they provide are majorly dependent on government funding, they must adhere to the regulations and restrictions dictated by the government.
In Sweden, Finland, and the Netherlands, the government directly handles all resettlement, and it's actually considered part of the welfare system. So they provide significant and thorough support to the refugees. In contrast, refugee resettlement in the U.S. is overseen by the Department of State. They contract the VOLAGs to provide resettlement services, providing the funds to do so. This funding is used to provide services and support to the incoming refugees for the time that the VOLAGs support them. Additionally, staffing is dependent on the amount of government funding the agencies receive, making the number of employees at the agency dependent on the number of refugees they resettle. Part of Trump's executive order was a ban on any refugees entering the country for 120 days. We learned that this doesn't only affect the refugees who can't come as a result of the ban, it also affects the refugees that are already here and the people who provide them those services. The Director of Catholic Charities explained to us that as a result of this ban, there was an extreme reduction in the number of refugees they expected to receive, and they had to do serious staffing cuts.
In Salem, the VOLAGs that currently provide resettlement services are Catholic Charities and Lutheran Community Services. These agencies are involved with placement, arrange for the refugee to be greeted at the airport, and provide services through federal funding for up to 6 months at the absolute maximum.
In all of their endeavors, however, one of the main goals of resettlement agencies is to guide integration into new life. Because integration is not a clear or linear process, we can think of it on different levels, with basic needs such as secure housing and employment at the base as a necessary foundation for successful life. However, we might consider how this notion of integration is limiting in its scope. A more individualized approach to integration looks at how comfortably one navigates life in terms of having community, understanding the systems they use, comfort in one's own space, and generally feeling like and being treated as an integral member of society.
The possibility of 6 months of support is divided into 2 parts: reception and placement and the match grant program. Reception and placement is the basic program that all refugees are resettled through. Through this program, agencies are involved with the refugees for a minimum of 30 days and a maximum of 90. RMP is funded by the Department of State, which allocates a one-time fund of $950 to the agency for each individual they resettle. In addition to going towards housing, food, and clothing for each individual, these funds are also support staffing and space for the resettlement agencies. Essentially, the duties of the resettlement agency can be understood as placement, greeting, and services. Upon arrival, refugees are greeted at the airport and taken to housing, where they are provided with furnishing and climate-appropriate clothing. It is also required that the agencies provide a culturally specific hot meal on that first night. The rest of the time that the agencies are involved with the refugees, an assigned caseworker from the resettlement agencies assists them with navigating state social services and meeting with the family once a month.
The second program, Match Grant, provides an additional 90 to 120 days of support from the agency, which must be applied for within 31 days of arrival. Designed to reduce the number of refugees receiving cash assistance from state programs, Match Grant focuses on employment and self-sufficiency, covering expenses like rent and utilities so that the refugees can fully focus on finding sustainable employment. Funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, agencies receive $2 for every $1 they receive from the community for a maximum of $2,200 in federal funding per individual. Through these funds, though these funds are allocated per person, they are given to the agency in general so that the agencies can allocate them according to Match Grant recipients' individual needs. The question that still remains about Match Grant is how many refugees receive it and who gets to receive it.
When we talked about the self-sufficiency that Match Grant tries to provide, the program director at Catholic Charities described, well, it's a self-sufficiency which means covering your own bills on your own without cash assistance, but you can still be receiving food benefits and things like the Oregon Health Plan. While securing housing and employment are essential steps towards an independent life, it is by no means an indication of a fulfilling one. Not wanting to diminish the incredibly important role that VOLAGs play in moving refugees towards a life with economic security, limited interaction and time restricts them from taking an individual approach to providing support. We need to ask, what gets left unaddressed?
A volunteer team leader that we spoke with said that their self-sufficiency is increasing, but to be completely self-sufficient takes years. In class before we started, we spent a lot of time connecting with stories about migrant experiences. Though reading a theoretical analysis will also tell you that integration is multifaceted, we were really able to understand that settling into a new life is so much more than just housing and employment. If you have those things, if you have self-sufficiency and your children are in school and you can navigate the city like a local, you still need life to be meaningful.
Resettlement agencies are restricted by both time and resources, limiting their focus on refugees' basic needs. Sometimes support is only 30 days, and though the agencies are nonprofit, the number of employees they can sustain is largely dependent on federal funding, which is, as we have just said, $950 per individual. Since the agencies are dependent on the funds they receive from the government, they must follow restrictions and regulations regarding those funds.
Because they're privately funded, parties independent of the government are able to provide a wider range of services without restrictions. And because these parties aren't dependent or affiliated with the government, they're able to provide services even after the VOLAGs have become uninvolved. When we consider situations like refugees becoming homeless because they aren't able to find affordable housing after the agencies become uninvolved, it is clear that we need a comprehensive support system to fill in the gaps.
One of the most significant ways that refugees are supported is by volunteer teams. While volunteers have to be approved and briefed by the resettlement agencies, it is typically the private citizens that organize the volunteer teams by reaching out to people they already know. In places like Portland, where resources have to be stretched between a lot of families, teams might have only 1 or 2 volunteers per family. In Salem, the large amount of volunteers and the relatively small amount of families means that teams have about 6 to 8 volunteers per family. This means that these teams assist in navigating a new life, provide a reliable support system, provide access to a network of resources and expertise, and provide transportation when needed.
A volunteer team leader we spoke with said that when she became a volunteer and was briefed by the resettlement agency, she learned that the guide to communicating with refugees was to be open, ask them what they need, and respond to what they need, and don't think that you know better than they do. Our contact at Catholic Charities expressed the same perspective in connecting with individuals and being culturally sensitive. He said there's no rule book.
When we asked the volunteer team leader where the refugees needed the most support, she said, they need help initiating any new process.
Think about American 18-year-olds who grew up in the US with all its systems, going out into the world, trying to file taxes, filling out job applications, understanding and applying for credit cards. It's difficult enough for them when they have people to explain it to them. Not only do many of these refugees have the additional difficulty of a language barrier, they often haven't gone through such processes in any language or country. For example, there are some refugees who have grown up in refugee camps and have never been exposed to anything remotely comparable to those systems they're now expected to navigate effectively.
Caseworkers, volunteers, and expert resources serve as guides to navigating unfamiliar and complicated systems, addressing an important aspect of the process of self-sufficiency. These guides can help refugees with navigating systems such as getting health insurance and an Oregon Trail card. The Oregon Trail card, which is Oregon-specific electronic benefit transfer card, allows recipients to receive food stamps and cash assistance.
As many of you know, a little over a year ago, Anya and Doug Holcomb started Salem for Refugees, and in a short amount of time, they've become a prominent resource in the community. In order to get a better sense of how the private sector in Salem works, I attended a couple of Salem for Refugees monthly meetings, which are open to the public and held in Salem Alliance Church. The most obvious thing when you attend a Salem for Refugees meeting is that the people involved really care. People give what they have to offer, whether that be expert legal advice, connections with the school board, deep pockets, or just pure time and energy to give. By bringing together refugees, resettlement agencies, various resources, and a wide support base, we can see the larger image and find out what gets left unaddressed and where we can give more help. How can we help, and how?
At the meetings, experts and dedicated volunteers combine efforts and resource teams in order to support refugees in the areas of education, employment, English, housing, health, and hospitality, the last of which includes the technology, legal, and meals teams as well. Essentially, the teams provide a network of resources to volunteer teams striving to stimulate communication and collaboration between the various support systems available. In the same way that Salem for Refugees is a resource to the volunteer teams, the expansive and quickly mobilizing network can fill in various needs for the resettlement agencies, such as finding volunteers or helping case managers find last-minute housing. In addition to serving refugees indirectly through these various channels, Salem for Refugees also has a fund for emergency assistance.
One way that we saw the close intersection of volunteers and religious organizations was in a monthly meeting called Supper Club, which provides a community space for refugees in Salem. The idea started at the Meals Resource Team at Salem for Refugees and materialized when a volunteer was able to get her church, Westminster Presbyterian, on board. They agreed to provide space for free and donated a startup fund, and they were able to hold the first meeting in March. Volunteers from various churches prepared the meal, set up the room, which is pictured on the right, and set up games for the kids to play. Recognizing that incoming refugees may be practicing Muslims who keep halal, Supper Club prepared 1 chicken and 1 vegetarian soup so that people with restrictions had options. They prepared a delicious meal, had a space for children to play, and provided a much-needed space for community connections to be made. The reason that Supper Club is so important is that there currently aren't facilitated social networks for refugees in Salem. Even though people are coming together from a wide range of cultures and languages, they have the common experience of being resettled. And more importantly, new refugees may take comfort in meeting those who have had a little bit more time to integrate, telling them that they're not alone in this endeavor.
In this way, Supper Club is an example of how the network of volunteers, churches, and organized efforts can produce positive results in an environment for community connection amongst the refugees in Salem.
Another area that is often left lacking by a limited view of integration is English acquisition. As we mentioned previously, the systems are often really difficult to navigate, and when you add the challenge of a language barrier, integrating into life becomes exponentially more challenging. Think about the employment side of integration. Language acquisition plays a huge role in one's ability to not only find employment, but to find meaningful employment. even people who are highly skilled. A low level of English will maintain them in a low skilled job. Additionally, the need for employment makes attending classes for getting more English more difficult. A volunteer tutor we spoke with said that as more and more of her students found jobs, a class of 14 dwindled down to 5 or 6.
Recognizing how important English is to employment, Mid-Valley Literacy offers workplace English tutoring to help students be successful in their current jobs with the hope of moving forward to more meaningful employment. The classes at Mid-Valley are taught by volunteers who go through an 8-hour training, which includes a cultural sensitivity training, and then observe 4 2-hour classes before they can teach students.
When Salem started getting more resettlements, Catholic Charities talked to Mid-Valley Lit about providing English tutoring for the incoming refugees. Mid-Valley provides language services for free to all refugees, and the resettlement agency will pay for their language assessment. For low-skill students, Mid-Valley has classes. Mid-Valley has classes specifically for refugees off-site at St. Paul's Episcopal Church and at the First Congregational Church. When choosing the locations, they were very intentional in making sure that both locations were along bus routes and that one, St. Paul's, has childcare. Those who have a higher level of English proficiency will attend classes on-site at Mid-Valley so that they can be advanced to higher levels at a faster rate. They also have a connection with Chemeketa Community College where students can go onto a higher level of ELL and even start the process of getting credentials transferred over if they have a degree from another country.
While there are some areas of integration that need intense attention, such as English, the private sector can also address typically unconsidered aspects of integration, as one generous community member has done. As a private donor, the individual recognized how useful and beneficial technology can be and made an effort to address it. They donated $30,000 to Catholic Charities in order to buy smartphones and services for each incoming refugee. Additionally, recently this individual has begun buying Chromebooks for each family in Salem. The recently established tech team at Salem for Refugees is looking into offering technology literacy tutoring for those who need it.
The program director at Catholic Charities expressed what little structural support refugees have when he explained, technically, you can open and close an RMP case in 30 days. That's it, and you're never expected to talk to the client again. 30 days, that's it. That's all they would have in terms of support from their sub-agency. That's absolutely mind-blowing.
Recalling that agencies are given a mere $950 in just a few months to help refugees integrate into their new life, it is clear why the private sector is important to successful settlement. While the established system of resettlement equips the refugees to survive, the private sector enables them to thrive. By stepping in to provide support and services for so many aspects that get left unaddressed or underaddressed by the resources allocated by a priority reassessments, the private sector is able to support refugees in terms of their own specific needs.
In addressing refugees' specific needs, we can begin to understand how to shape a supportive network specific to the city of Salem. Considering that resettlement in Salem is so new, the amount of progress and organization is honestly incredible. In order to continue to improve the support network of refugees in Salem, we can continue to ask questions and remain open to suggestions to help us grow and learn as a community.
There are efforts within Salem for Refugees to compile a database with all of their resources in order to provide a comprehensive guide for volunteer teams. Even though the private sector in Salem has a network of resources, in doing this research, we were able to gain some big picture perspective and see where the system can be strengthened. There were several instances where people we spoke to mentioned wanting more communication with other groups, leading us to conclude that interconnectedness of the support networks in Salem could be cultivated more. Promoting attention to communication and cooperation in the private sector will allow for a more well-rounded and thorough community support.
For those who want to get involved, they need to ask what is really needed. There's a lot of energy and will, but not the necessary direction or focus. While some groups have an excess of volunteers, others struggle to find them. We have observed a need to direct the spirit of volunteerism in Salem and suggest that a volunteer coordination team would be a useful asset in organizing private sector support.
As we have mentioned, religious affiliation was extremely prevalent in the private sector. Local churches play an instrumental role in the theme of volunteerism. We have seen that parishes provide an established network of volunteers, promote a spirit of service, and donate space and resources. Even though the religious organizations involved are secular in their actions, we wonder if there are any potential limitations to the private sector mainly operating in religious spaces.
When talking with individuals in the private sector, we observed that there was an inattention to the possible discrimination refugees may face. The only instance in our research when prejudice was brought to our attention was by a local cleric who recognized the prevalence of Islamophobia in our society, and talked about promoting a spirit of understanding and welcoming in his parish. We observed that attention to this very real issue seems to be missing from the private sector, and feel that a dialogue about the discrimination faced by refugees must be opened in the Salem community. Throughout this research, Brenna and I felt extremely grateful to be able to observe and document the incredible spirit and strength of volunteerism in Salem. According to the program director of a locally operating agency, settlement in Salem wouldn't exist without the expansive volunteers. After conducting the research we agree. He said, Salem is very different. The in-reach is huge, and with the reduced staffing because of the executive orders and the lower number of arrivals, I definitely would not feel as confident as I do about our operations continuing to have more arrivals settled in Salem if we didn't have that network at Salem for Refugees and also the volunteers that we bring on board as well.
The spirit of volunteerism is defying popular perception about Salem's ability to welcome new members to the community. We saw that volunteers dedicate their time, money, and energy because they truly want to impact and improve individuals' lives. In the short amount of time Salem has been a resettlement site, organizations have been formed, volunteers have mobilized, and relationships have been cultivated. Overall, the future of refugee resettlement in Salem is very promising.
In closing, we just want to thank everyone who worked with us and talked with us throughout this process, not only for meeting with us, but for all of the amazing work that you do. All of you in the Salem community is really what makes the private sector of Salem so special. As we're consistently reminded, the private sector is the heart of refugee resettlement. So thank you for everything that you do. We also want to thank Joyce Millen and Phoebe Wagner for helping us with this presentation and this project. So, thank you. Sorry, I forgot my on. Do you guys have any questions or concerns? Yeah.
So there seems to be this myth that this is the first time Salem's really been involved with the refugee. It's not. Salem was very, very active in the Southeast Asian refugee resettlement. Huge amounts of Southeast Asians came to Salem. And so I think this is a regeneration of that same system. It kind of went dormant for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. I think we didn't really connect the two maybe as much as we could have. But a lot of the stuff that's happening is really new. Like Salem for Refugees was just started like a year ago. Oh yeah, no, it's totally, yeah, no, it was dormant for a little bit and was in hibernation. That's a good one. Yeah.
If I can just contribute, I'm Father Zach from St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and and I think there's things that are happening that are very new here in Salem, and then there's ways that when Salem recognized and welcomed refugees from Southeast Asia, that sowed seeds for this kind of welcoming as well. I can say in my own parish, we have this tradition which has been going on for 30 years, which is called Chai Yo, and it's because when we helped Vietnamese refugees settle back in the 70s, one of the families was really kind and donated a recipe for these Chai Yo spring rolls, and it's turned into a fundraiser at our church that we do every year for music departments, and so you regenerate that story about welcoming refugees every year. And so I thought, just given that point, that's the story. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi. So I've got a question. It's kind of an offshoot, but I'm actually curious because of the work you guys did. I'm doing a project on undocumented immigrants in sanctuary cities, in looking at the work that's been done here in Salem. I know there's a huge divide between refugees and undocumented immigrants and the paths that they go to settling down here. But I'm curious in the services that are offered by the churches here in Salem, do any of those services get offered to undocumented immigrants here?
So the ELL is open to everyone.
Yeah.
So like Mid-Valley Literacy opens classes to everyone. The only difference between other students and refugees is that they cover all the expenses for refugees.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Supper Club is not open to anybody but refugees because it's such a small thing. If it was open to the public, it would, I think they're trying to find funds for the next one even. So I think some of them are very specific to supporting refugees. Like we said, they're coming together through these grassroots efforts, and there is this established spirit that is specifically concerned with refugees. But the previously mentioned organization, ERCO, for example, serves anybody who needs their help. So it's definitely a wide range of who they serve.
All right, cool. Thank you very much. My name is Nick. I'm a student. I'm a graduating history student at Willamette University.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's an important part. Yeah. All right, thank you guys so much.
Our next team is from the employment sector, and we have Peter Oakes and Kitty Lively.
Hi, I'm Katie.
And I'm Peter.
And we, as the employment team, focused on the various resources, barriers, and factors present in Salem with regards to refugee and immigrant employment. While we will refer to immigrants, the emphasis of our research did fall mainly onto refugees. However, many of the resources that we found could be repurposed to aid immigrants as well.
So why does employment matter? It has many other effects other than mere survival. So it aids in the integration of society, aids in the sending of remittances, primarily in the case of immigrants, gives a sense of dignity, provides a sense of familial honor, and can aid in language acquisition. It also has an important role in mental health. Employment serves as a major part of social integration, a lack of which leads to social isolation, which can in turn lead to mental health problems and exacerbate already present conditions. So the timing of employment is also very important. The earlier one is employed, the higher both the average wage and likelihood of steady employment is. However, a delay in employment can provide a more fitting job to one's skills and lead to both higher wages and opportunities for advancement in the long term.
So for our research methods, the first half of our semester was spent studying both personal narratives and academic works on the subject in order to gain foundational knowledge of the information. Then for our background research, we looked for relevant scientific and business articles on the subject in order to gain specific knowledge before conducting our interviews. When we went out into the community, we focused on ethnographic interviewing of individuals who have had direct contact with immigrants and refugees and who could provide a unique perspective on the current goings-on in Salem with regards to refugee employment. We interviewed individuals from ERCO, Salem for Refugees, the Oregon Employment Department, WorkSource Oregon, and Interpretive Services. We found that Salem is still in the early stages of refugee reception and has several interesting traits not generally seen, which include a community bursting with volunteers, growing interest in the general community, and private businesses happily employing and training newly employed refugees.
So while there are cultural disconnects between our culture and the cultures in which we're receiving refugees, so we first must consider what it's like to be a refugee in some arriving in the United States. In some countries, it's the exception, not the rule, that a young person can find a job. For example, countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo are officially measured to have a youth underemployment rate of over 80% and an unemployment rate of 58%. Imagine how odd it must be then to be removed from a culture in which employment may seem so far out of reach into a community and space where the main objective is to find employment as quickly as possible. There are also distinct differences in the ideas of employment between cultures. One of the easiest, most quantifiable measures of these differences is the dependency ratio, the ratio of those not in the labor force to those within the labor force. To continue with the example of the DRC, the Congo had a dependency ratio of 96:1 in 2015, and compared to the US, which had a dependency ratio of 22:1 in 2015. These numbers don't imply the superiority or inferiority of either culture in terms of employment, simply that there are different societal priorities set for employment in each culture. The lower employment rate in the Democratic Republic of Congo is also accentuated by continuing violence in the wake of the civil war that ended. Refugees can also spend an average of 10 years in a refugee camp. And the presence in a refugee camp affects the availability of work as well as its reliability. And while volunteer organizations do offer jobs to refugees, they're in scarce supply. There's also varying employment in destabilized nations. They have a higher percentage of itinerant day workers. Records of employment are often lost or non-existent, and larger fluctuations exist in the availability of jobs in general.
So for our research, we examined resources that are available both within Salem and in the state of Oregon as a whole. Two that we found within Salem are the employment team at Salem for Refugees, one of the specialized subgroups of Salem for Refugees, where volunteer teams help with the finding of a job, the interview process, and transportation to and from that job. Volunteers use search engines and also utilize resources such as WorkSource Oregon for this. Another organization is Professional Interpreters, which is a private business that was founded in Salem. It serves Salem and the surrounding areas for interpretation and has begun to work alongside Salem for Refugees and increase its services with the organization. It hopes to eventually employ the refugees it helps in order to become proficient in less common languages and aid other refugees, leading to kind of a pay-it-forward system.
So as the education team noted, we also investigated IRCO. IRCO is a public-private partnership that is beginning to expand from Portland to Salem. It aids in refugees in a variety of ways, everywhere from education and language acquisition to helping them find employment. It currently has one workforce specialist in Salem, and he primarily finds jobs through internet searches and by contacting employers directly. And he's had very wide range of success with these rather unspecialized tools.
So we examined two major statewide resources, the first of which is WorkSource Oregon. WorkSource utilizes the iMatch Skills database to match migrant workers to potential employment opportunities, and then from there assists in career advancement. Sometimes that looks like a managerial position within the original field, sometimes that's a completely different direction entirely. The other major resource we looked at was the Oregon Employment Department, which is a state-run office that distributes unemployment benefits and provides statewide employment services, as well as providing job-specific search tools. We are sure that there are also federal resources available, but we have not investigated enough to be able to speak on those.
So entrepreneurship is also a very effective way of employing refugees. So it can serve to aid with social integration, even in the face of a language barrier, which in turn can help with the release of social tensions. It can provide communities with diverse culture-specific crafts and can revitalize economically downtrodden communities by adding new sources of employment and revenue. There are also organizations that are thriving in the U.S. Based on this model. For example, the African Development Center in Minnesota is an organization which focuses on aiding African refugees. It provides financial education, loans, and training for entrepreneurs and aids in housing development.
While it's not the size of the ADC, there's a similar organization, NEDCO, that has recently moved to Salem from Springfield, Oregon. It costs $75 per household for unlimited counseling and classes. The classes center around financial management and investment classes, as well as housing information. And in its current state, it would be more helpful to those who speak English and Spanish, but it can be adapted with the help of interpretive services.
So there are also differences between nations in our transitional services. So the United States, for example, emphasizes early employment through short-term financial assistance times. And it focuses on the acquiring economic independence as early as possible, and it has little in the way of state-run training or transitional programs. Canada, on the other hand, uses both government-assisted refugee programs and private sponsorships to resettle refugees. And GARs offer financial assistance for up to 1 year after arrival, and private sponsorships offer varying lengths of funding. Sweden and Norway is the opposite extreme. It's almost entirely state-run services. And arrivals are immediately enrolled in full-time introductory courses, and these programs provide language instruction, social services guidances, employment counseling, and job training to refugees.
We want to now shift our focus to some barriers that still exist to immigrant and refugee employment, the first of which is public transportation. This is not available at all times and is a point of particular strain for volunteers as it increases difficulties for immigrants and refugees traveling to and from work. It also serves to limit the number of available jobs for refugees, as movement outside of areas without available public transport is difficult. Another major one is English acquisition, which is one of the most common issues for refugees in both employment and everyday life. Classes currently taught in Salem are offered at Mid-Valley College and are taught by volunteers. While this is a good start, furthering the amount and availability of classes as well as increasing the length of them would be very helpful. Interpretive services would be exceptionally helpful in job interviews as well. Those are now beginning to expand in Salem through the growth of professional interpreters.
So as Katie mentioned, it's not usually realistic for someone who's new to a country to acquire a driver's license, which leads to a dependence on others to provide reliable transportation. For those who work during the hours of operation for Salem-Kaiser Public Transit, this is fine. For those who work on weekends, when the public transit is not in operation, or work in an area where Salem-Kaiser Public Transit doesn't have a route, this can be very problematic. We've also heard of private individuals who offer free transport to their businesses during their employment hours.
So, when we spoke with a representative from Professional Interpreters, she discussed the link between all of the different elements of immigrant and refugee settlement in a new location, and we felt that this quote from her really provided an astute summary of why we're all here today. She said, "I think it's the all-around aspect of helping. It's not just on the employment side or not just on the medical side. It's complete acclimation to the culture, including just having first-time friends to be able to teach you English."
So, Professional Interpreters is a service that is continually expanding. Right now it has just over 100 interpreters that can interpret for 25 languages. The most common languages among interpreters are Spanish, Russian, Vietnamese, Chinese, and ASL, but Arabic is also becoming increasingly common. But they have found few interpreters for Arabic, but more interpreters who can and are willing to speak Arabic are still in a high need. The highest need is still Somali, and there's not many people in Salem who speak Somali, let alone those who speak it well enough to be able to interpret effectively. The biggest challenge the organization has had is in finding people who are confident enough in both English and another language to be interpreters. Plenty of people are interested in helping, but not many feel safe and confident in doing so. As someone who works for Professional Interpreters put it, they're afraid to step out of the shadows to help other people because they're afraid it's going to help themselves. And that quote was directly said about this pay-it-forward system where they hope to employ refugees to work as interpreters.
So looking at some goals for interpreting services in Salem, Professional Interpreters is working toward increasing confidence in its current English language learners by teaching through conversational methods, using what's already familiar to them to put them at ease. This may include speaking about music or about something that's on TV, because it's an easy and calming thing to describe in one's own language, and the lower pressure feeling of the subject leaves people more comfortable using that English vocabulary that they're currently learning. The main question that Professional Interpreters bases their curriculum on is, how did these people learn their native language? Cultural differences in education can impact how successfully someone learns a language, because in the United States, we're always telling people to take a break and not stress themselves out when learning. But for example, people who follow the more traditional Japanese educational style encourage people to study for hours to learn new things. And if we're teaching people from other cultures the same way we teach people who are originally from the United States, we may unintentionally leave them feeling even more uncomfortable with learning in an already unfamiliar environment. Eventually, Professional Interpreters hopes to have a pay-it-forward culture within the program so that those who were formerly served by the program come back to serve others, providing a more direct understanding of these immigrants' and refugees' experiences. Some employers are now willing to have an interpreter sit in on a job interview. While at this point this is a very small number, Professional Interpreters is working toward finding interpreters who are confident enough to provide that service for interviews, job trainings, and any other employment situations that may arise.
So the United States does offer immigration waivers to immigrants in certain employment positions, such as astronauts that qualify. However, not every career that requires a high level of education is. However, not every career that requires a high level of education qualifies, and so many immigrants and refugees who have received a higher education are left with significant labor force experience that does not transfer over into this country and leaves them overeducated for positions that would accept their that they are qualified for due to their lack of English skills. Even people who do qualify for this waiver are often unable to find work that matches their education, and many of them end up teaching instead. We learned about one refugee in Salem who was a mathematician in his home country, and his wife was highly educated as well. When they came here, the education that employers, their skills did not transfer over, and they were forced to return to college to acquire an education that employers here would be more likely to accept. However, the job he was initially able to acquire did not pay enough for him to be able to go to a university, so he's now having to take math classes at a community college in a subject that he was considered an expert in his home country. A study published in 2009 showed that immigrants that have prior labor force experience in their home country are more likely to receive poor job matches due to being overqualified for the positions they are able to attain in their destination home country. WorkSource in particular works to combat this by not only using specific iMatch skills database to match immigrants with employment, but also following up with them to help them work toward a higher, perhaps managerial level of work, either in their current field or in another direction entirely after they've gained initial workforce experience in the States.
One benefit of President Trump's order to reduce the number of refugees allowed to settle in the U.S. is that it does give us more time to prepare for those who will come, and this will help us be even more efficient than we have ever been, learning from past mistakes and utilizing new resources to be more effective than ever.
So we do have further questions that were raised in our research that we don't have the answers to, and we think that they could be a very interesting thing to just think on, and if anyone has any comments on them, we'd be more than happy to hear them. The questions are: what cultural differences exist between various refugee groups and U.S.-born peoples in relation to employment? What can be done to improve entrepreneurial aid to refugees and immigrants? How can we further the pursuit of interinstitutional cooperation? How can we reasonably plan to improve language comprehension and confidence in immigrant and refugee groups? And how can we effectively use the advanced education that many refugees and immigrants bring to our communities?
And finally, we just want to acknowledge all of the wonderful people who have helped us in our research. Asfal Fufa from Ergo, Jerry Griffin from Salem for Refugees, Diana Tapia from Professional Interpreters, and Alan Martinez and Danielle Quinones from WorkSource Oregon.
We'd also like to thank Professor Millen and Phoebe and our viewers like you.
Comments or additional aspects for our employment team?
I was wondering when you were talking to different employment services people, whether there was any discussion of sort of, finding that first job, but then kind of talking about a pathway to job improvement, a career ladder, education, that sort of thing, or whether it was just focused on getting the job and that's it?
It was mainly focused on acquiring a job initially so that they could, we focus almost entirely in the States on earliest possible self-sufficiency, whereas other countries also have different focuses, obviously.
Maybe I didn't understand what you were talking about, but the interpreter agency that you're discussing and the people that they're trying to recruit to do interpreting, do they train the interpreters?
They do, yes.
They do train them. And then after they train them, they still feel like they don't have confidence. Is that the idea? Is that the point you were making?
No. So some native speakers who come as refugees don't have they have very good English comprehension, but they don't have the confidence to use it. So that was mainly directed towards refugees who have gained the sufficient amount of English knowledge and who are very good with English, but they just don't have the confidence to basically interpret.
And that comes not after a training, but before, during the initial recruitment process as an interpreter. They may be afraid to, as we said in the presentation, step out of the shadows and be able to help others in this area.
Great. Thank you for those of us who are, or for those of you who are still with us. This is our last presentation. So if you want to take a moment just to stretch for a second as we get set up. But our final group will be in legal and law enforcement, and we have Karen Espinoza, Johanna Yarvinden, and Carrie Milstein.
Okay, hello. We are the legal and law enforcement team. I'm Kari.
I'm Karen.
I'm Johanna.
Our focus has been talking to the community and collecting various perspectives, trying to construct a picture of what the legal services look like in Salem today. So, as a base for our knowledge, we studied both academic and cultural literature. We attended community events such as Salem for Refugees meetings and Know Your Rights trainings put on by the Human Rights and Immigration Clinic here at Willamette. We've also interviewed key members of our community, such as a dean of diversity from another local college, two private immigration attorneys, a chief of police, and a City of Salem employee who specializes in multicultural affairs. So there are some themes that we have found to be significant while doing our research. The first of these is privilege, and I'd like to suggest some questions for us to think about. First, who is afforded the privilege of not having to constantly worry about their legal status, and who has to think about issues of citizenship on a daily basis? The second is access to services. What kinds of services are being provided and who has access? Are there gaps that need filling? The third is complexity. How can anyone, let alone someone new to the United States, be expected to navigate the complex and constantly changing policy web of immigration law? And the last is vulnerability, fear, and anxiety. What can be done to minimize vulnerability during the integration process, and how do our laws and enforcement techniques promote fear and anxiety to the immigrant and refugee communities here? So these are some of the legal services being provided currently. Salem for Refugees has a law group that informed us that their short-term goal is training volunteers to help refugees fill out legal paperwork. Their more long-term goal is to provide training for refugees on how the legal system works in the U.S. and how to navigate it, but the group is not allowed to provide legal aid or legal services. There are various private immigration attorneys in the area, the Human Rights Immigration Clinic, which I mentioned, the Legal Aid Services of Oregon, the Oregon Law Center, and the Lutheran Community Services provide free or low-cost legal help for low-income residents. And there is also various community education meetings. Law and Legal Services is the first of two sections that we'll be discussing in our presentation. And I'd like you all to keep in mind that it's assumed by our federal courts that a reasonable person will have a basic understanding of the law in the U.S. Refugees and immigrants fall under this category and are therefore not protected by the law, even though they may have extenuating circumstances which will cause them to have a lack of knowledge about their rights and other legal situations that they might find themselves in.
Right. Something that kept coming up during our research in the community was the need for more extensive education on the American legal system and how this education could be provided in the Salem community. The need for this education might be for different reasons. For example, people are new to the country and unfamiliar with local laws, or they might be in a particularly vulnerable position because of their legal status. So what might this legal training look like? It could be, for example, information about your rights or how to access legal services, possible pathways to citizenship, or how to safely engage with a law enforcement official. This legal education would empower refugees and immigrants to have a stronger understanding of local legal culture, the local legal system, sorry. This is linked to providing more sustainable services that promote integration in the long run. This team, in general, encourages us to reflect on our own knowledge of the law and how much we might know going into an unfamiliar legal system. So how do you navigate a familiar, or even an unfamiliar legal system? The field of immigration law is highly complex and bureaucratic, which tends to cause problems in terms of access to services. Sorry. There we go. We were faced with the question of who can or should provide legal services for immigrants and refugees. The particularities of immigration law are so complex and sensitive that specific training is required. Because of this, these services are often very expensive. The timelines for cases can also be very long. So for example, a family reunification case can take more than 10 years to solve. Training more legal aids could reduce the bureaucratic workload of immigration lawyers, making legal assistance more accessible in the short run. In considering this kind of skill shifting, we should consider the benefits, but also possible negative consequences of this. Many of these cases are highly sensitive. Sorry, I'm sick. Many of these cases are highly sensitive, and if services are provided by less qualified people, that might result in harm for the clients. Many attorneys in the Salem area provide pro bono work on pro bono cases or provide low-cost services, but this has not been sufficient in guaranteeing everyone access. Even if you're educated on the legal system, what you need if you do get detained is legal representation, and this is expensive. So something that was important in our research was trying to encourage the community to acknowledge this gap and work towards more sustainable solutions for providing legal services to immigrants and refugees. This might include both education on the legal system, but also making sure that they're represented by qualified attorneys if need be.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about our second section in our presentation, and that's going to be law enforcement. And so first, we just wanted to address the relationship that exists between different law enforcement units and how this has caused fear between both the immigrant and refugee communities. And so this fear derives from the unclear connections between law enforcement agencies and the way they work together and how they share information within each department. An example of this confusion can be seen among both refugee and immigrant communities in regards to what specific relationship exists between both law enforcement and ICE. To further explain this concept, let's just say that if I were to be an undocumented immigrant and I were to be detained, among the very first questions I would be asking is whether or not local law enforcement is going to share my legality with ICE. Are they going to deport me, or are they just going to simply charge me for the crime I have committed without further looking into my legal status? This lack of clarity for the public about the relationship between law enforcement and ICE has added to both refugees and immigrants' fear of deportation, and as a result, it has weakened their communication with law enforcement. The fear of having a family member or loved one be deported should not be considered, and it's not an irrational fear. Keeping all of this in mind, we asked the following questions. What is the cost of this fear to society? How does this fear affect both refugees and immigrants' integration to our community? For example, do the children of undocumented immigrants and refugees experience and perceive law enforcement differently than those children whose parents are U.S. citizens? Besides the unclear relationship that exists between law enforcement and ICE, there are also other type of issues both immigrants and refugees have to face. The language and terminology that has been and is still being used in legal documents and immigration laws, such as the usage of illegal alien or illegal immigrants, adds to the dehumanization of undocumented immigrants and further emphasizes their outsider status. This then led us to our next question. And how can we as a community build trust with both our immigrant and refugee neighbors when the current administration is perpetuating the negative language through which we understand and talk about immigration? The language we use also further promotes stereotypical assumptions based on a person's characteristics, such as the skin color or language proficiency. Racial profiling factors heavily into issues surrounding immigration as people fear undue attention from law enforcement. Today, as our current president seeks to implement immigration policies that would enable our local law police officials to act similar tasks as an ICE agent, adds to the continuing confusion about the relationship that exists between law enforcement and ICE. And this confusion is not only seen among both refugee and immigrant communities, but it's also seen within our own local law enforcement agency and immigration attorneys. And here we have a quote from a chief of police that we interviewed throughout our research, and he states, "Where it really impacts us is people are afraid to call the police. Somebody can be the victim of the crime and are afraid to call us because they think something bad is going to happen to them. And all we want to do is know about the crime and help them. If any portion of our community is afraid to call us, then our ability to take care of them is negatively impacted." As you can see, what he states further demonstrates the fears that undocumented immigrants living in our community face daily in their everyday lives, which limits them from calling the police as they fear for their own safety. The prevalence of fear in the community limits the ability of law enforcement to do their job as police officers. This fear is linked to both the complexity of the legal system and law enforcement. The challenges of communication from law enforcement to the community enforces these fears and places people, especially immigrants and refugees, at a higher vulnerable position in our community.
So one of our main conclusions was the importance of communication and interconnections. Between the legal system and law enforcement, communication is imperative. Other important connections exist, however, between the themes we examined and those presented by the other groups today. The pervasiveness of law, legal status, and anxiety towards law enforcement impacts how immigrants and refugees function in other sectors of society, such as housing, health, employment, and education. It is important to acknowledge that not only are immigrants and refugees vulnerable because of their legal status and relationship to the law, but may also be vulnerable from many other factors, such as being exposed to a new culture and language, having an unstable housing or employment situation, being separated from family, or having a different educational background. I'd like to end with a call to action and a reminder that regardless of your position on migration, the people who are here already need well-organized and inclusive services in order to become a more successful member of our community. This will also help us be more prepared for future arrivals. Helping these services acquire resources and properly communicate with each other will benefit the entire Salem community.
We'd like to wrap up today with a few more questions for all of us. First of all, do we need more emphasis on legal education, and how can these educational programs be advanced by the community? How can we as a community ensure that we are aware what kind of services are needed and ensure also that everyone has access to these services? For example, what could be efficient ways to provide more low-cost legal services? How does the community in Salem perceive immigration law and citizenship? Because many of us never have to Many of us never have to deal with issues around citizenship in our lives and how pervasive these can be in a person's life. So what might a further understanding of these topics give the community? And finally, what role does language have in building trust, and what impact might it have on access to legal services as well as providing them? And finally, we'd like to thank all the people who have made our research possible. We'd also like to really kindly thank anyone who came to the symposium today, and we look forward to continuing our discussion around these topics in the community. I don't know.
So we can focus our attention on the legal and law enforcement issues, but also open it up because we have a half an hour, well, we have more than a half an hour to have a discussion and to address some of these topics of concern.
Hi, I am Nick. That was really great. The paper I'm doing is encompasses a lot of that, and so this was really great. I have just one question. In one of my conversations with a local volunteer leader here in Salem, I was told that there is some difference in practice between the Salem PD and the Salem Sheriff's Department. Do you guys know about any, or have you guys heard about that at all? Just in terms of their cooperation with ICE and stuff like that.
So we've actually only talked to the Salem Police Department, not the Sheriff's Department, so I can't speak specifically to that. We did learn a little bit about the connections between the Salem Police Department and ICE. I don't know how much of this is common knowledge, but it is known that in Oregon, the police departments are not, it's not legal for them to use any of their resources for ICE-related endeavors.
On duty, correct.
On duty.
Yes.
Yeah, or any government-sanctioned resources in general. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't be able to call an ICE agent when they were off duty, unfortunately, but.
Well, one of our points was that it's so unclear. Even when we were speaking to the chief of police, he was kind of confused. But then he said that they have absolutely no relationship to ICE. He didn't even know if there was an ICE, because we're asking him if there was an ICE office in Salem or around. He didn't even know. But yeah, but we couldn't talk to the sheriff department, unfortunately.
As we wrap up here, we have this space for a little while longer, so I encourage you to network, talk with your peoples, and look at the work that the students have done. Fill out these cards, and I don't know if you recall what the request was, that if you have an idea, even if it's a small idea, about how to improve services here in Salem, Oregon for immigrants and refugees, then we would like to hear your voice, and we'll compile these. Also, let me reiterate what I said this morning. All of the presentations, the student presentations, will be made available online through a special portal through Willamette website. And that'll be made available May 15th if you're interested in having all of this. And again, these are works in progress. And just to also reiterate that we know that the work is limited, the students didn't have a lot of time, but frankly, I don't know if you agree with me, I think they did a really awesome job.
And now I would like, no, Professor Millen, stay up here. And I'd like Phoebe to come up to the front too, please. I just want to take a moment. I don't know if some of you who maybe plan events understand the moving pieces that went into today. But for those of you who don't, they've been spending, and this is like Phoebe's dream, this has been over a year of work and effort and time and stress and all of the above. And so we'd really like to give them a big round of applause and give them these flowers that we got for them. We figured, a bouquet dies, but this one hopefully you can keep alive. So if we could give them a big round of applause, that would be great.